Chapter 843. Outside the study was a long corridor with a balcony. The stone pillars that supported the ceiling at intervals were covered with moss. The sunlight passed through the shade of the oak trees and left golden spots on the walls and floor. A few sparrows landed on the railings of the balcony. After Brando taught the Roman a good lesson, he opened the door and walked out. The birds immediately fluttered their wings and flew away. He looked at the scene and closed the door with a click. It was as if he subconsciously wanted to say, "Scarlet, prepare the carriage, we're going to Port Gris." But just as he opened his mouth, Brando was stunned. In his memory, the girl with a long ponytail always leaned on her spear and leaned against the second stone pillar in the corridor. Sometimes she would feed the sparrows with breadcrumbs. He had seen this scene several times. The girl was quiet, but beautiful like a character in a painting. But now, the second stone pillar was empty, leaving only the mottled sunlight shining on the moss. Brando sighed. He could not help but smile bitterly. In the distance, at the spiral staircase at the end of the corridor, Amandina, who was holding a stack of parchment documents in the dark, also sighed quietly. She saw her lord standing there with a lost expression and understood. Her knuckles were a little white, and she almost accidentally crumpled the parchment. But those were the most important documents in the territory, and the lord had not looked at them yet. She was shocked by her own actions and hurriedly let go of the parchment, but she accidentally scattered the rolled-up parchment on the ground. Amandina was stunned. She bit her lower lip, then bent down and picked up the parchment one by one. She touched the necklace in her collar in a daze. It was a necklace that had lost its pendant, but she seemed to feel that the pendant was still in place. She pressed on the empty spot. But when she finally reacted, the girl looked at Brando in the distance with a complicated expression and silently retreated. Brando stood in front of the study door for a few minutes before he came back to his senses. It seemed that since some time ago, he had been used to the silent mountain girl beside him. He used to tease Scarlet about this, asking her how she would get married in the future. But he did not expect that one day she would really be gone, and he felt a little at a loss. What's wrong? Brando could not help but press his temples. Brando, oh Brando, Scarlet can't be by your side forever. She has her own future. But when he thought of this, he felt a little depressed. He shook his head and threw this thought out of his mind for the time being. Veronica and her party stayed in a hostel in Port Gris. It was only half a day's journey from Castle Abes to Port Gris by carriage. Brando understood that the lady did not want to stay in Abes for her own reasons. After all, she was the commander of the Empire's army, and it was not surprising that she could not get too close to a foreign count. Not to mention the Empire's wanted criminal, Greysword Saint Mephistopheles, was still living in Brando's castle. It was reasonable for her to stay away or at least make a gesture. But what really puzzled Brando was why Veronica wanted to see him now. It had been more than 2 weeks since they arrived in Tanajul. Logically speaking, she should have returned to the Empire long ago. Her mission here had also come to an end. Not to mention, she had the Empire's eldest son and the Folded Sword Knight Regiment with her. He really couldn't figure out what the female Legion commander was thinking. He didn't understand why she was so worried and hesitant. The interior of the Empire was peaceful. Other than some uneasiness at the border, it didn't seem like anything major was about to happen. With such doubts in his mind, he walked through the corridor and down the stairs. When he passed through the hall outside, several apprentices of the Shire were arguing about some magic-related issues. Because the Shire's wizard tower was built in the castle, his apprentices also lived in the servants' rooms in the castle. Fortunately, the wizard world had strict rules, so these apprentices did not bring too much trouble to the life in the castle. When the apprentices saw Brando, they stood up respectfully and greeted the young lord. Brando also nodded in response. These people were selected from the children of adventurers or local small nobles. Most of them, or the families behind them, were grateful to the lord for such an opportunity. Wizards with real heritage were very rare in Wonde. Most of the academic wizards were from the Buga branch, but how could the knowledge of the Silver people be so easy to learn? Even in Cruz, only Miss Scholar Shido was qualified to be favored by the Silver people. It was precisely because of this that wizards with heritage, whether it was in Erewhon or Cruz, had a very high social status, far superior to those charlatans. Charles, on the other hand, was a descendant of the Black Tower mages. Even if he was only a branch of the Buga mages, he was still considered to be from a prestigious family. The opportunity to become an apprentice of such a mentor was like a pie falling from the sky for these small nobles in the remote countryside, not to mention those poor adventurers who lived in poverty. Hence, it was not surprising that they had such thoughts. Amandina also saw this point. She advised Brando to take this as an opportunity to win people's hearts, and allocate the few places to those who were truly loyal to him, such as the daughter of the copper dragon Redo, Su. With such a connection, all the reliable people would be firmly tied to his war chariot of interests. But Brando himself did not see it that way. In his eyes, this was not just a vanity fair. These young wizard apprentices should be the future of Tanajul. An army without a wizard regiment would always be regarded as a third-rate army in Wonde, not to mention the coveted floating fleets of crews and the wind elves, each of which was operated by a wizard. Could even be said that wizards were the high-tech soldiers of Wonde. Every one of them cost a lot of money to cultivate, but it was absolutely worth it. And this was only the 1940s, the era when the Slate War had not yet begun. Of course, some of Amandina's statements were also reasonable, and the Shire had mentioned more than once that Su was quite talented, so Brando also accepted part of it. In fact, he himself was also quite optimistic about the girl who seemed to be only left with healthy wheat-colored skin and a head full of fine braids. The calmness she showed in the Battle of Ampere Seal was simply amazing. This was the most basic quality of a wizard, but not many people could do it well. Su's performance in this aspect was more outstanding than most wizards before she was a wizard. It could be seen that as long as she could feel the lines of law, she would have a bright future one day. And as a bonus of this decision, as Amandina had said, the copper dragon Redo was indeed very grateful to him. The veteran who had experienced the November War could remain calm in the face of death, but his daughter was his only weakness. He originally wanted to leave a property for Su, but he did not expect to encounter the invasion of Madara. Now that Su had the opportunity to become a wizard, although she would not have a prominent position in the future, at least she would not have to worry about food and clothing. The key was that she would not have to live under someone else's roof, which was especially satisfactory to Redo. However, there were also some negative effects. Several times, that guy secretly came to inquire about his intentions in a roundabout way, asking if he was interested in his daughter. That guy actually thought that he could not see through his probing. Brando felt that his intelligence was severely underestimated, and there were several times when he angrily chased that guy back to Maxim territory. In fact, this was not a case. At one time it was very troublesome for him. For some reason, the probability of women having magical talent in Wonde seemed to be much higher than that of men. Although it was often easier for male wizards to become true geniuses, like the Shire and Fleetwood, the number of female wizards was greater than that of male wizards. This was an indisputable fact. This directly led to the Shire having more female subordinates than male subordinates. It was like the kind of master would have the same kind of subordinates. At one time, people suspected that this was actually just a way for the Shire to establish a harem. Especially in this kind of poor and remote place where magic was not flourishing, the rumors were even more outrageous. However, what made him not know whether to laugh or cry was that the small lords and nobles were not tired of it, and kept on stuffing the so-called rather beautiful noble ladies into his territory. As for whether they were truly beautiful, Brando really did not comment on it. In any case, he had already asked the Shire to send all those who did not have magical talent back. However, what made him a little depressed was that this matter had become a laughing stock in his small circle. Medisha and Amandina had used this matter to make fun of him more than once. This was really a case of the servant running rampant when the master was not in command. Thinking of this, he could not help but shake his head. As he walked out of the arched door of the hall, he suddenly frowned as he smelled the aroma of barbecued meat. He stopped, turned around and asked, "What's that smell?" The faces of several of the Shire's apprentices changed, and they all began to stutter. "The Shire did not teach you the silent spell, did they?" Brando had actually guessed a bit and could not help but ask in a bad mood. Sure enough, as soon as his voice fell, one of the girls with a small round face and some cute freckles on the tip of her nose, who was said to be the youngest daughter of the city's Silversmith Guild's president, was so scared that her face turned pale. She stuttered and replied, My Lord Count, Mr. Shida did not let us say it." Sure enough, Brando shook his head. Even Alaz had been taken away and this guy was still at large. However, this was a good thing for him. After all, Shida had signed a contract with him. No matter how ridiculous the contract was, if Shida was really taken back to the Dragon Clan, then he would have lost a lot. He waved his hand, indicating that the girls did not have to worry, and then turned around to follow the smell of charcoal with the aroma of meat. He did not know what this guy was roasting, but he could only hope that he did not set the castle on fire. Last time this guy secretly roasted meat at the sawmill, and as a result, half of the sawmill was burned down, causing the little Roman to pay a large sum of money. In the end, the merchant girl was fine, but the housekeeper Amandina was so heartbroken that she could not sleep well for a few days. He turned around a corner of the castle that was covered with vines, and saw Sheeta squatting behind a grape trellis, secretly tending to a bonfire. There was an iron shelf above the bonfire, and on the shelf were a few almost cooked prawns. This foodie was holding bottles and jars and smearing seasoning on them. Needless to say, this set of things must have been stolen from the kitchen. This guy did not have much combat power, but his ability to steal chickens and dogs was first class. Perhaps even the master nightingale of the halflings would have to admit defeat in front of him. Come to think of it, this existence that could steal a dozen carriages under the noses of Veronica and Mephistopheles was not a simple character. Brando walked over and patted Sheeta's shoulder, scaring him. He turned around, his round face full of charcoal ash. It was hard to imagine that this was a dragon, because he looked no different from a naughty child. When Sheeta saw Brando, his face turned pale with fright and he hurriedly shouted, "I did not cut the grape trellis for firewood, I did not steal these things from the kitchen, they lent them to me." "Very good," Brando sneered. The flower-bed left by Grodin was now Amandina's treasure. Although he had never seen the noble lady in a rage, he knew that the calmer a person was, the scarier they were when they were angry. He could not help but pat Sheeta's shoulder in admiration. "You are very brave, Sheeta. Do you know that the person in charge of the daily living arrangements in Abe's castle is Miss Amandina?" "What does that have to do with anything?" Sheeta was stunned. He did not expect Brando to not be angry, and he suddenly felt a lot more confident. "It's nothing," Brando chuckled. "For example, the kitchen did not prepare a dinner or a main meal. In fact, it is a matter of course. After all, there are too many people and it is possible for there to be occasional negligence. Not to mention occasional, even if it happened for 3 or 4 days, it is not a big deal." Sheeta's mouth was wide open and his expression changed. The little fatty stared at Brando with wide eyes, his face alternating between red and white, and his forehead was covered in sweat. It was as if he had never seen the dark side of society before. In fact, this is not the worst. It is said that there are people who mistakenly ate something they should not eat and died. You know that this place is close to the Black Forest, and there are all kinds of materials in the castle's warehouse. There are a few that are particularly effective for dragons. Sheeta was almost scared to tears. The little fatty suddenly felt that this was completely possible. Besides, in his opinion, Amandina was gloomy and ignored everyone. Maybe she already disliked him and wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible. He almost trembled and reluctantly picked up a grilled shrimp from the charcoal fire. He said to Brando with snot and tears, "My lord, please don't expose me. I will treat you to a shrimp and after eating we will be in the same boat." "Damn, you don't have to be so obvious about dragging me into the water," Brando thought in annoyance. But when he saw the shrimp covered with mustard on the putty claws of the young frost dragon, he felt that it looked familiar. He could not help but ask, "Where did you get this shrimp?" "The kitchen." "No, your first sentence can't be the truth," Brando analyzed with experience. "Have you been to Hippamra's room?" The little fatty rolled his eyes and shook his head like a rattledrum. Brando was so angry that he laughed. The shrimps in Hippamra's room were the favorite of the priest girl. Although he did not know why she liked to raise shrimps, as long as he saw her carefully carrying the water tank out to change the water every day, he knew how important this thing was to her. Now, these shrimps had become Sheeta's meal, and Hippamra did not need to get up early every day to change the water. It was just that someone or a dragon would have to pay a heavy price for this. He looked at Sheeta with pity and turned to leave. What a joke, who knows what kind of trouble he would cause if he stayed with this jinx. Unexpectedly, Sheeta was very perceptive. He seemed to have seen his tragic fate from the expression on Brando's face. He hurriedly wrapped all the shrimps in oil paper and chased after Brando without saying a word. It was as if he wanted to follow Brando to the ends of the earth. "What are you doing?" Brando asked in annoyance. Sheeta stuffed a grilled prawn into his mouth and sucked on his chubby fingers as he replied in a muffled voice, "My lord, are you going out?" "You're quite smart," Brando sneered. "You know how to escape." "No, Sir Lord, didn't I sign a contract with you? Now I have to fulfill the contract and protect you." Sheeta thought seriously for a moment and smacked his greasy lips. "It's dangerous outside the castle." "Dangerous my ass," Brando thought to himself. If it was half a year ago it would not be safe outside the city, but now Tanajal's security could be said to be the best in the Southern Territory. There were patrolling cavalry on the road and cavemen in the forest. There was no room for monsters and bandits. What's more, how could ordinary monsters and bandits do anything to him? This guy was obviously lying through his teeth. But Brendel was too lazy to care about him, and the two of them walked towards the stable. When they passed by the short rose bushes that Madame Camille was taking care of, Brendel suddenly thought of something and turned back to ask, "Speaking of which, why didn't the dragon clan send someone to capture you, you scourge?" He thought that Sheeta would be proud of himself when he mentioned this question. After all, even Alaz could not escape from the clutches of the demon, but he could continue to be free. This was a very glorious thing. And without the little female dragon's restraint, he could obviously be more lawless. But he did not expect Sheeta to blink and look a little disappointed. "What's wrong?" Brando was slightly startled. "That's because Alaz is willing to go back with them. In fact, we rarely attack each other. If she wants to stay here wholeheartedly, they won't force her." Sheeta pretended to be a little careless and replied, "But Sister Alaz still admits that she is one of them, so she has to abide by this rule." Brando keenly caught the key point in this sentence. "You're not really completely expelled from the dragon race, are you? What's so good about staying there? They only know how to collect some inexplicable things." Sheeta replied with some pride, "They don't understand that food is the most important thing in this world. Collecting food is a biological instinct. Gold, silver, resplendent diamonds, no matter how precious they are, they still need food to fill their stomachs." "Damn, that's a pretty simple theory of yours." Brando looked at the little fat dragon with some amusement. It was obvious that the little fat dragon was very unwilling to give up, but still pretended to be indifferent. But for a dragon, being passionate about collecting food is a bit too strange. In our legends, dragons should be breathing flames and standing on top of mountains piled with treasures, burning to death those adventurers who came to covet their treasures. Dragons are creatures that coexist with beauty and danger in our impression. But if this legendary dragon is lying on a mountain of rice, just imagine, then the ornamental value will be greatly reduced. This is prejudice. Sheeta could not help but jump up and down. P.S. Wait a minute, there's another chapter. Chapter 844. Brando thought that he would have to prepare the carriage himself, but when he arrived at the courtyard, there was already a four-wheeled carriage parked on the main road under the shade of the trees. The black carriage had the exclusive emblem of the Abes. Other people in the castle rarely used carriages, so this carriage was most likely prepared for him. Although he was still a little puzzled, who knew that he was going out? Could it be Medisha? Although the silver elf princess was polite, she would never do the work of a servant. He went around to the other side of the carriage and saw Amandina waiting by the door. Amandina's eyelids were drooping, and she was holding a large volume of documents in her hands, obviously waiting for his arrival. "My lord is going to Port Gris, the carriage has been prepared for you." Amandina crossed her hands and placed them on her skirt above her knees. She stood by the door and said respectfully, "There are biscuits and pastries in the carriage drawer. I ordered the kitchen to make them because if we go now we won't be able to make it in time for dinner. In addition, there is some recent information about the Empire under the table. Although it is not much, I think it will be useful for my lord." She was still rambling with a straight face as if she was reciting a book. Brando's heart was filled with warmth. He was still thinking about who arranged the carriage for him, but who else could it be? Other than Amandina, who else could try to organize his messy schedule and frown and preach to him with a straight face? She advised him to have a more regular life and schedule. Apart from this slightly quiet girl, who else would be able to lower herself like this? It was almost impossible to remember that she was once a well-educated young lady from a noble family. She was the only one. "Thank you, Amandina." Brendel stood in front of Amandina, and Sheeta was still sucking his chubby fingers one by one behind him. He smiled slightly. The last breeze at the end of summer was blowing through the canopy of the castle, rustling. The birds flapped their wings through the gaps between the branches in the sunshine, and the sound of their wings seemed to cover the whispers in the woodland. Amandina trembled slightly. She looked up at Brando, her dark eyes contained a layer of complicated light, and then silently lowered her head again. "This is what I should do," she opened her mouth and complained softly. "If it was a Roman lady, my lord, you wouldn't be polite enough to say thank you to her." Brando was surprised to see that her face was red all the way to her neck, as if this sentence used up all her courage. He carefully savored the meaning of this sentence. The girl's heart was like a silent flowing song that had unknowingly filled his heart. He reached out and held the door handle, passing by Amandina. The two of them seemed to be unable to see each other. Brendel opened the door and replied, "Indeed I won't." He let go of her hand, straightened up and faced Amandina and answered seriously, "But I won't tell her. Get in the car, Amandina, and come with me to meet the envoy from the Kurlutz Empire." For a moment Amandina stood there in a daze. The wind at the end of summer seemed to be too noisy, the clouds moved slowly in the blue sky, and time seemed to flow backward for a moment. A teasing smile appeared on Brando's lips. "Do you need me to help you get in the car, my lady?" "No, no need." Amandina lowered her head, as beautiful as a swan, but she felt her face was hot. "There are still a lot of things in the territory, a lot of documents I haven't dealt with yet. I'd better not go, I'll leave it to my lord." "Aren't these documents in your hands?" "We'll deal with them in the car. It's still half a day from here to Port Gris, we have plenty of time. Tanagel's late summer and early autumn scenery is beautiful. I want to see this land that belongs to us, come with me." Brando interrupted her and opened the door. Amandina was still a little hesitant, but the heavy sweetness in her heart finally won over her reservations, and she lowered her head and sat in the car. She finally understood that his lordship had sensed her feelings. This was enough for Amandina, for her, this was enough. The girl's hands were almost cramped on her knees, clutching her skirt tightly, and her head was almost buried in her chest shyly. She had never expected to go further, and this was already good enough. Brando then got in the car, and Sheeta also shamelessly squeezed in. The three people in the car did not speak, and the quiet air was filled with a faint fragrance, both the smell of summer's incense and the thoughts of a young girl. The carriage rumbled, slowly passing through the castle gate, crossing the suspension bridge, passing through the prosperous streets, and after leaving the city of Abes, it gradually turned into a continuous rural landscape, rolling hills, green fields, distant woods, windmills, and shining rivers. The carriage passed through the lush avenues, crossing the stone bridge paved with white stones, and the scenery of Tanajul had long formed a coherent picture. Brando sat by the window, silently watching all this. His heart was filled with a kind of comfortable warmth. In this world he was no longer alone. Many people lived because of him, and he lived because of many people. People needed each other, and civilization existed because of this bond. Warmth, love, and family were like a constant voice in the blood, knocking on everyone's heart. It existed forever, and it was endless. Milos and Ko Hua had asked the same question. What was the true meaning of this dark, ignorant, and humble civilization and order? It was not as glorious as the ancient times, nor as vigorous and unyielding as the Silver Age, but the answer might be in this. Because of kindness and hope. Port Gris was no longer the same as before, and it was difficult for nostalgic people to find the taste of the past here, but no one was noisy. Today the harbor had 15 snow-white trestles that went deep into the blue bay, and the bay shore had long been dug deep enough to anchor the big ships with snow-white sails. Neat cobblestone streets ran through the east, west, north, and south, and caravans filled with goods shuttled back and forth, dividing the new harbor into a neat shape. Just like Abes, the old shacks had long been torn down and replaced with beautiful permanent buildings. The red-tiled roofs had long become the symbol of the city, and only a few areas near the northern forest of the harbor still had traces of the old fishing village. The Shepherd of Bucci was a hostel opened by a Roman merchant, and it could be said that it was the only official hostel in Port Gris. However, this hostel in the downtown area was not as crowded as other places, and only merchants with the permission of the Count of Tanajul could stay here. Occasionally, Medisha, Amandina, and other people from the castle would stay here temporarily when they came to the harbor. Therefore, this hostel was not so much a commercial hostel as it was an official relay station of Tanajul. However, there were many guests staying in the hostel recently, but these guests were different from before. Most of them had blonde hair and blue eyes, and although they were polite, it was inevitable that their noses grew on their foreheads. The people of Erewhon found it difficult to accept the arrogant attitude of the people of Cruz towards foreigners, although sometimes this attitude did not come from the heart, or rather, it was a habit formed naturally by the accumulation of pride over a long period of time. But in the words of the owner of the hostel, a veteran of the Red Bronze Dragon mercenaries, it was really enough. Now the hot-tempered owner simply announced that he was sick, and left everything in the hostel to the servants to take care of. In the blink of an eye he had not appeared for more than a week. When Brando's carriage stopped at the entrance of the hostel, this was the scene that greeted him. He saw Miss Scholar at the door, Shido holding a drawing board and sketching by the side of the street. She seemed to be curious about everything here, and the scenery of Tanajul had indeed given her a different perspective. Especially when she heard that this place was a barren fishing village a year ago, and there were no more than 100 people coming and going. The residents could see noble knights all year round, and most of them were tax collectors from Abes. This description was not strange to her, and it was described in books everywhere in Erewhon. But the Count of Tanajul told her a different story about this kingdom. Several young knights volunteered to be the escorts of this young lady. Most of them recognized Brando, and although they were closer to Maynard and Freya, they still came up to greet him. As a Kurlutzian, this attitude was very rare. If the owner of the Shepherd's Inn was here, his eyes would have popped out at this moment, and he would worship his lord even more, perhaps even prostrating himself on all fours. Brando also asked with a smile, and Amandina followed behind him. She was also a little surprised by her lord's reputation among the citizens of Cruz, but at least she knew more than the people below, so she was not too surprised. Shido, on the other hand, put down her paintbrush when she saw Brendel. She stood up and bowed respectfully to him. Brendel was slightly startled because he saw that the scholar girl was holding the courtesy of a student to a teacher. If it was said that the young people of the Folded Sword Squad were polite to someone who had fought side by side with them, this salute was somewhat grand and inexplicable. He couldn't help but look at Shido. Shido explained politely and seriously, "My mentor once said that the one who has reached the top is the teacher, and the Count's conduct and actions can be a model for us nobles. This time when I return to Kurlutz, I will definitely tell my teachers what the Count has done. At least now I understand that the glory of the ancient nobles has not disappeared from this land, and the things that the benevolent Eric took away from the Empire and guarded are still taking root and sprouting in this soil." Brando saw the serious light in her firm eyes, and could not help but shake his head with a wry smile. This noble lady was still as simple and naive as ever, but it was still hard to get angry with her. Not to mention he was a little embarrassed and his words were a little exaggerated. Although he was happy to see all this, some of what happened in this land did not originate from his heart. When he was impulsive and angry, he never thought of such long-term things. He shook his head. At this time, Lenoret appeared at the corner of the stairs leading to the hall on the second floor of the inn. He came down and glanced over as usual. He did not say much, but Brando already understood that this might be Veronica's intention. At this time, only His Royal Highness could stay by the female Legion commander's side, and perhaps Shido, but this scholar lady did not seem to be someone who could stay idle. He hurriedly said goodbye to the others and then followed. Lenoret did not say a word and led the way in front, leading him to Veronica's room. When he opened the door, Brando was shocked because there was another person in the room besides Veronica. He also recognized this person, bald, bearded and one-eyed. This appearance was too conspicuous. This was Mangrove, the Legion commander of the Black Legion, and the Marshal of the Empire in the Third Holy War. Brando almost cursed out loud. What the hell were his scouts doing? They let such a big fish sneak into his territory without him knowing. This was one of the 4 Legion commanders of the Empire, and his strength could be said to be higher than Veronica's, second only to his teacher Mephisto. A person of his level was like a nuclear weapon in the Empire, and now this nuclear weapon had unknowingly come under his nose, but he did not know. He could not help but look back. Amandina's face was also a little pale, and she obviously recognized the other party, which meant that she did not get any news at all. "Brando, you're here?" Veronica finally noticed Brando and Amandina behind him. She and Mangrove were sitting at a low table opposite each other. The latter had a pipe in his mouth and the flame in the pipe flickered. He was smoking, so the room was also filled with smoke. Brando frowned, but immediately understood what was going on. For a person like Veronica, who actually had a slight obsession with cleanliness, with her status she could tolerate it. Firstly, Mangrove was indeed her senior, and secondly, there must be something more important that attracted her attention, so she was not in the mood to fuss over these trivial matters. Veronica seemed to notice Brando's expression, and immediately understood what Brando was thinking. She first motioned for His Royal Highness to close the door, so only Brando, Amandina, and the 2 Legion commanders were left in the room. Brando felt the door click behind him and he could not help but feel a little strange, wondering what had happened that even Lenoret could not sit in and listen. He felt that the situation was beyond his imagination, so he calmed down a little and waited for Veronica to speak first. "Brando, this is—" "Forget it, I see that you've already recognized him, so I won't make any unnecessary introductions." The female Legion commander sighed halfway, feeling a little helpless at Brando's vigilance. She looked at him deeply. "I always felt that you were very concerned about the Empire, and very vigilant against us. Although I don't know why, you can rest assured this time. Mangrove came here through some special means, and even the Holy Cathedral of Fire was fooled, so it's reasonable that you didn't notice." Brando looked at Mangrove, who was staring at the map of Cruz spread out on the short table, and did not even look at him. This was in line with the usual behavior of the Cruz nobles, especially with his status. Naturally he would not be polite to a mere Count of Erewhon. He looked at Veronica again, and the female Legion commander's explanation made him feel a little better. After all, if even the Holy Cathedral of Fire was fooled, then fooling his spies was not a big deal. He could not be arrogant enough to think that his scouts were better than the Holy Cathedral of Fire surveillance network. However, Veronica's words made him feel a heavy sense of crisis. Mangrove was an important representative of the military faction in the Cruz Empire. What kind of major event had happened in the empire that made such a person not hesitate to take such a big risk to go to Tanajil alone to meet with Veronica, and even to the extent of hiding it from the Holy Cathedral of Fire? Brando's mind was in a mess, and the first thing he thought was, could it be that the religious and imperial factions were at war? Had the Cruz Empire started a civil war? That was great, and it was a godsend for Erwin. The weaker Cruz was, the less pressure Erwin would have. This was an indisputable fact. However, Brando shook his head, thinking that there was probably no such thing as a free lunch in this world. Cruz's current empress father had taken back the right to speak in the empire from the religious faction with the help of the prime minister. Less than 100 years had passed, and the position of the imperial faction was still very stable. Moreover, the Holy Cathedral of Fire did not seem to be a short-sighted existence. They openly rebelled, and that was the national religion of the entire Cruz culture. Even if there were one or two idiots in the highest ranks, most of the others would still be clear-headed. Besides, Brando remembered that the person at the top of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was still the wise Vala. If it was that person, it would be impossible for his subordinates to make such a mistake. However, it was possible for Her Majesty the Empress. Brando did not know much about Her Majesty the Cruz Empress. To be honest, he was more familiar with Lenoret, the future emperor of the Cruz Empire. Although Her Majesty the Empress was tough and was known as the Iron Queen, in fact, her style of doing things was a little too self-opinionated. However, in history she did not have 2 years to reign. This time, Lenoret would soon become the real crown prince after returning and then ascend the throne. The Cruz Empire would enter a long period of ascension, and this would also be the beginning of Erwin's tragedy. So what was going on now? Brando looked at the two famous historical figures in front of him and suddenly felt that there was something wrong with the whole history. P.S. The second chapter of this week's weekend. I hope you have a good weekend, and by the way, roll around and beg for monthly votes. Chapter 845. Brando, do you remember when we first returned to Tanajil? I asked you to keep our whereabouts a secret and not announce it to the public? In the smoke-filled room, it was Veronica who spoke first. Brando nodded. There was indeed something going on, so Princess Griffin had to wait until Freya arrived at Valendon Castle to hear the news of their safety. The injured Maynard and her party, including the wounded of the Folded Sword Knights, were also placed in Schaflund. Ko Hua and her sister went to Valhalla, and Medisha and Hippamra's activities were mostly limited to the castle. Although they usually met with the servants and apprentices in the castle, in fact, these people generally did not leave the castle except for festivals and celebrations. Amandina had also given strict orders that at least until the harvest festival, the news should not be leaked. As for the princess, although it was a little unreasonable for a sister who cared about the safety of her brother, when Veronica warned him, her expression was very serious, so he reluctantly agreed. He looked at the anxious expression on Veronica's face and was slightly stunned. Could it be that the news was leaked? Then the problem could only be with the shepherd's hostel, but the owner of the hostel was an old subordinate of the Copper Dragon, a veteran who had experienced the November War. His background was absolutely reliable, and it was unlikely that he would be bribed. The other possibility was that the young people of the Folded Sword Knights were seen by someone, but the probability was too small. Today's Griffin was a commercial port, and a large part of the merchants who came and went from the south to the north were Cruz people. These few young people were too inconspicuous, not to mention they were not wearing military uniforms. Brando thought for a moment, and finally decided to wait for Veronica to speak. Amandina stood behind him and did not interrupt. Her eyelashes drooped, and her dark eyes flashed with a faint light. She seemed to be thinking about something. Rings of smoke were rising in the room, forming the shapes of mountains or monsters. Marshal Mangrove was smoking from his pipe, which flashed dark red. He held it in one hand, his elbow on his knee and his other hand on his thigh. He was wearing an overcoat and without raising his head, he stared at the sheepskin map on the low table, as if some treasure were hidden there. Veronica smiled bitterly and continued, "Do you want to know why?" Brando shook his head. "I'm not used to prying into other people's secrets, but I know this is very important to you, and it's just a small matter to me, so I'm willing to help." "Thank you, Brando." Veronica nodded and looked at him with some appreciation. At this time, Mangrove knocked his pipe on the side of the table and finally raised his head. He used his remaining left eye to look at Brando, But strangely, Brando did not see the usual arrogance of the Cruz people in the deep-set but very sharp eye. Instead, it gave off the feeling of a general sizing up a soldier. "You did well, Count Mangrove. You did not disgrace your grandfather." Mangrove spoke in an authentic Cruz dialect. He was born in the wild north of the Four Territories, and he carried the wildness of the northerners in Cruz. However, this burly old soldier only gave a brief comment, as if he had only looked up for this random comment. He then bit on his pipe and did not say anything else. Brando was almost a little flattered. One must know that in a year's time, Mangrove would become the commander of Cruz's army and succeed his grandfather as the marshal of the coalition forces. His authority in the empire could be said to be second only to the Queen, and the supreme of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was only on equal footing with him. "Brando, in fact, we hope to let Lenoret continue to stay in your territory and not announce this news to the public." Veronica hesitated again and finally said with some difficulty, "I mean, you'd better let the outside world think that he's dead. Do you understand what I mean?" Brando was stunned. Palace struggle. This word seemed to come naturally to his mind, and a series of plots of intrigue and disputes had been rehearsed in his mind several times in an instant. The first thing he thought of was that after the big explosion, the other heirs of the empire might be ready to make a move. After all, in the eyes of outsiders, it was unlikely that anyone could survive such an explosion. But in that case, shouldn't the news that the eldest prince was still alive be announced as soon as possible? What was Veronica's plan? Could it be that the military was supporting someone else, so they wanted to imprison the eldest prince of Cruz and Tanajil forever? This idea was too dangerous, and Brando was so scared that he broke out in a cold sweat. However, in his view, Lenoret's expression did not seem to be the case. If that was the case, the eldest prince would probably be under house arrest by now. He looked at the female legion commander suspiciously. Veronica and Mangrove exchanged glances. The former looked very troubled, but the latter took off his pipe, blew out a smoke ring and nodded firmly at her. "We suspect that Her Majesty wants to kill his eldest son." The female legion commander finally spoke. "What?" Brando and Amandina exclaimed in unison. The two of them looked at each other and seemed to see the shock in each other's eyes. Amandina's eyes were filled with disbelief, and she instinctively suspected that this was a conspiracy. She was almost stunned on the spot. But Brando himself was much calmer. He took a small breath and forced himself to calm down. "What's the reason?" "Sit down first, I'll tell you what happened." Brendel nodded and led Amandina to the sofa across from him. Veronica was impressed by his calmness. "Sit down first and I'll tell you what happened." Brendel nodded and led Amandina to the sofa. Mangrove was still smoking his pipe, and Veronica paused for a moment before she continued to tell the story of the whole incident. "This matter started from the political environment of the empire. Our situation is different from Erewhon's. For the past 1,000 years, the main problem that the empire has faced has always been the dispute between the royal and religious authority." Her voice was calm and steady as she spoke. Her eyes shone with a faint green luster behind a layer of smoke. She crossed her fingers and placed them flat in front of her chest. But the truth that she spoke of did not seem to be that mysterious to Brando. The people of Cruz were founded because of the Flame King Gretel. Just like how the late King Eric was to Erewhon, Gretel, one of the four wise ones, also left behind a belief for the people of Cruz. He used this belief as the basis for the founding of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. After Gretel's death, the people of Cruz never had such an outstanding king. And in the history of the empire, politics and religion began to gradually separate. From that moment on, the hidden danger of the dispute between the royal and religious authority was buried. In the following 1,000 years of history, the dispute between the royal and religious authority never stopped. Unfortunately, most of the rulers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire were wise and far-sighted, so the empire never fell into a state of disintegration because of this dispute. However, the rise and fall of the royal and religious authority seemed to form a historical pattern. In the tide of history, the empire gradually separated into several traditional forces. The first was the representatives of the church in the secular world. The Cecil family was one of the leading representatives of the church. William, who was killed by him, was from this family. It could be said that the Templar Knight Order and the Cardinals of the Holy Cathedral of Fire came from these forces. The second was the so-called royal faction. Although the empire maintained a high degree of centralization, out of the 3 Grand Dukes' autonomous territories, 2 of them maintained marriage relations with the royal family. Among them, the Kirk family of Flowerleaf was the representative. The Kirk family had been married to the royal family for generations. Almost all of the family members had half of the royal bloodline of Cruz flowing in their veins. They were so closely related to the royal family that there was almost no distinction between each other. Brando met Vahina in the loop of trade winds was from this family. The third faction was the military. The people of Cruz revered martial arts, and the military nobles enjoyed a very high status. The four generals of the empire were from three prominent northern noble families. The northern nobles were almost synonymous with the military nobles in Cruz. Because of the frequent battles with the main enemy of the empire, the Hazel people, the region north of Bancal produced many outstanding soldiers. In fact, most of the backbone of the military came from the northern noble families represented by Ashrik, Nigel, and the Nana family. The military nobles leaned towards the royal faction, but the navy was an exception. Most of the navy of the empire came from the rich areas in the south. These rich children generally went to church schools and received a higher education. They were the staunchest supporters of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. But about 150 years ago, since the death of Rian the Pious, the religious power began to decline. 100 years ago, the Supreme of the Empire re-centralized power under the crown with the help of Prime Minister Naidevan. After that, it was supposed to be a new cycle, until the Silver Empress ascended the throne. The Empress herself was a relatively rare empress in the history of the empire. She hated the Kirk family where her mother was from. She also lacked trust in the royal faction, but she also hated the religious power. She played politics in the court and supported the now prominent Palat family to suppress the other two parties. But in fact she did not play it well. It was just that the current Archbishop of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, Vala, saw the toughness and firmness in Her Majesty's character and took the initiative to compromise. But Constance had offended almost all the noble forces during her reign. In the end, she did not have a good ending in her later years. After Leneret succeeded the throne, she was soon forgotten by the world and did not seem to have a good ending. However, Her Majesty the Empress had created a miracle. That was, she had been on the throne for almost 40 years under the hatred of almost everyone. During the 40 years of her reign, she had made all the decisions arbitrarily and almost turned the center of power of the empire into her own words. The so-called Iron Empress was, after all, not an undeserved reputation. Her Majesty has gone mad. Veronica sighed. She ordered people to draw a map of the entire continent in her room. More than once in private, she has bluntly said that her goal is to unify the entire Wond. Cruz has been expanding his army intensively for the past 10 years. We suspect that Her Majesty wants to use the Holy War as an opportunity to launch an all-out war. That's impossible. You suspect that she will kill her son because of this? Brando shook his head, feeling that it was a bit far-fetched. Of course not. Originally, with Her Majesty's physical condition, she would only be in power for 2 or 3 years at most. But to unify Wond in 2 or 3 years, Brando, how likely do you think it is? So you suspect that she will not go, but her physical condition will allow it? Brando asked suspiciously. In his memory, the Empress of Silver would indeed abdicate in 2 years. Brando, I said, originally, but Her Majesty is becoming younger day by day. Her health and energy are recovering to the prime of her life. Her Majesty once had a fortuitous encounter when she was young. Since then, her appearance has been fixed at the age of 15. But that only affected her appearance. This time, Her Majesty seems to be radiating youth from the inside out. Brando's first reaction was that it was impossible. In Wond, mortals who came into contact with the laws of nature would have their lifespans extended. It was common for beings like the sages to live for hundreds of years, but he had never heard of anyone being able to rejuvenate their youth. Even the spring of youth only changed one's appearance back to one's youthful appearance. Reversing the process of life was already against the most basic laws of nature. Veronica smiled bitterly. I knew you wouldn't believe it, but it's true. Mangrove wouldn't lie to me. Leneret is also the heir chosen by our military. We share honor and disgrace on this issue. Brando was silent for a moment, then said, so this is the reason why she doesn't want Leneret to continue to exist in the Empire? Veronica nodded and revealed a secret. In exchange for the compromise of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, His Majesty once secretly exchanged a verbal agreement with Vala. That is, after 15 years, the throne will be passed on to the first successor. And 15 years after the Year of Fire, there is only a year and a half left from now. In that case, how can the Holy Cathedral of Fire let her do as she pleases? When the female army commander heard Brando mention the Holy Cathedral, she couldn't help but feel a little emotional. She said, it's not that simple, Brando. In fact, the reason why Vala chose to retreat back then was because Her Majesty had the Dragon Clan behind her. The Dragon Clan? Brando was startled. It was the first time he had heard of this secret. He looked up at the two of them. Veronica looked helpless. Mangrove just smoked the pipe one breath after another until the dark red flame in the pipe gradually dimmed. He put down the pipe, but then took out the box of tobacco from his coat, as if he was so absorbed in his addiction that he didn't care about the life and death of the Empire at all. These two people didn't look like they were lying to him. Veronica nodded. We don't know the details, but the Dragon Clan does owe Her Majesty a favor. It seems to have something to do with her obtaining her ageless appearance back then. She paused and continued with some embarrassment. Although it is offensive to talk about Her Majesty's personal privacy like this, we can't care so much now. Brando, before Her Majesty became what she is today, her temperament was not like this. She used to be gentle and demure, and was the most beloved princess in the Empire. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that she was even the star of the royal family. Even the previous archbishop used to favor her. But after that incident, her temperament changed greatly. She became tough, cold, and opinionated. Very few people know the truth about what happened, but one thing is certain. The Dragon Clan played a major role in it. This happened 40 years ago? Brando asked. Yes. After that, the Dragon Clan signed a secret agreement with the Empire to compensate her. The content of the agreement was only known to the previous emperor, and the only thing that can prove the existence of this agreement is that the Dragon Clan was involved in the succession of Her Majesty the Empress. Her Majesty is the eldest daughter of the Empire, but in fact, according to Cruz's tradition, if one of the princes is capable of inheriting the throne, the eldest daughter is not qualified to be the Empress. However, the late Emperor seemed to have acquiesced to Your Majesty's existence. This matter was neither small nor big at that time. However, it is said that the previous archbishop also experienced this matter, so we, the younger generation, can't find any fault. Brando thought for a moment and asked, so, could it be that the Dragon Clan has appeared again? Veronica's eyes were full of praise, and even Mangrove stopped packing the tobacco. The one-eyed old soldier stopped and looked at him deeply. Brando knew that he had guessed correctly again. Then he could boldly assume that the Dragon Clan must have put pressure on the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Moreover, since Her Majesty the Empress had the ability to continue in power, the Holy Cathedral had no reason to force her to abdicate. As for the verbal agreement, after all, it was only a verbal agreement. It was just that. Lenoret did have a reason to die. Brando's brows gradually furrowed. He was thinking about whether this had happened in the original history, or whether it had been changed because of his arrival. In the Amber Sword, the Silver Empress abdicated 2 years later. What happened in between? At that time, the players had not reached the level where they could influence the decisions of the royal family, so no one should know the inside story including him. But there were too many possibilities. It was possible that Her Majesty the Empress at that time was also so crazy, but in the end she was stopped by the Holy Cathedral of Fire, Veronica, and others, and then history resumed. But what if it wasn't? Yes, all of this was still just a hypothesis. He raised his head, looked at Veronica, and asked, what evidence do you have to prove all this? Before I left the Empire, Prince Laser went missing and his sister went missing with him, Veronica replied quietly, but the facts she described were somewhat creepy. Her Majesty has always been quite indifferent to this matter, as if she didn't care, which alerted Mangrove, so he took Lenoret out of the White Rose Garden under the guise of taking him to experience the world. Laser was the 4th prince of the Cruz Empire. It seemed that this had happened in history, but he could not remember the final outcome, which meant that it was a small matter at the time. After all, the royal family was full of intrigue, and it was not surprising that 1 or 2 heirs died occasionally. As long as the one who died was not the first in line, it generally would not attract too much attention, let alone just a disappearance. But Brando felt a little strange and asked doubtfully, how could Her Majesty the Empress agree to it? Can't she see it? Mangrove tapped his pipe and finally said, it is a tradition of the Empire for the heir to the throne to go out to experience the world. Even Her Majesty the Empress can't stop it without a valid reason. Veronica also nodded in agreement. The core of this plan is that as long as Lenoret is not dead, Her Majesty can't openly deny the verbal agreement. As long as she still acknowledges the agreement, then Lenoret can be considered the most legitimate heir to the throne of the Empire. P.S. Today is someone's birthday, let's celebrate it early. 5,500 words, happy birthday little Tia. I'm watching you silently. The second chapter is posted at 5 o'clock. The previous chapter was written by the Grey Fin Naga. Thanks for the reminder. Chapter 846. However, this could only be regarded as suspicion and not evidence. Since Mangrove was willing to take the risk to come here, he must have real evidence. Brando continued to ask, and then? Then just a week ago, Cruz's diplomatic group arrived in Erewhon, Veronica replied. What do you mean? Brando frowned. This news was not new. A commander of Cruz's army and the first heir to the throne had mysteriously disappeared in the explosion. It was reasonable for Cruz to send a diplomatic group to investigate. It would be strange if they did not. He did not know why Veronica would make an issue out of this. He could not help but look at her suspiciously. On the surface, yes. Mangrove put down his pipe and replied slowly, but the problem is that there's an extra person in this envoy group. An extra person? That person is called Donis Burney, a secret envoy of His Majesty. Before he left the Empire, we learned that he came to Erewhon to confirm the death of the eldest prince. Brando seemed to suddenly understand. In other words, there was indeed someone who wanted to confirm the death of the eldest prince, and this person was very likely to be the Silver Empress, because Viscount Burney was one of her confidants. However, he was still a little cautious. The succession of the throne was no small matter, especially for an empire. He looked at the two people in front of him, thought carefully, and continued to ask, the appearance of this person can only explain one aspect of the problem. After all, the succession of the throne is not a small matter for the empire. It is reasonable for them to send someone to confirm the death of the heir. Veronica glanced at Mangrove, then replied, Indeed, but we have another witness. Oh. Brando was slightly startled. He wondered if these two people had kidnapped someone from the diplomatic group and brought them to his territory. That was a little too bold. Unexpectedly, the female army commander asked, Brando, do you still remember the lizard man sword saint you met in the spiral hall? Gio. Brando called out the name immediately. The experience of life and death had left a deep impression on him. I know this person. You know it? Veronica was a little surprised. Brando nodded. There aren't many sword saints in the first place. Besides, I'm on good terms with the Grey Fin Naga, so I'm not unfamiliar with their enemies. This person is from the Red Ring Lizard Men, and the Red Ring Lizard Men are the servants of the Dark-Scaled Naga, so I know him. He was the most famous warrior among the Red Ring Lizard Men when he was young, and he has been a sword saint for decades. It's now locked under this hostel. What? Brando wanted to jump up again. He thought that the guy had escaped back to the glittering sea after the explosion. He did not expect that he would become Veronica's captive. But he suddenly realized something and could not help but blurt out, could it be? Veronica fanned the smoke in front of her with her hand and replied, Brando, you must not know that the Dark-Scaled Naga has formed an alliance with Her Majesty the Silver Queen. So, a bold idea was forming in Brando's mind. The female general did not answer but nodded affirmatively. To her subjects, discussing these issues was treacherous. If she had to say those words personally, it would be no different from treason in their relationship. But that was enough. Everything was logical in Brando's mind. This person was indeed sent by the Silver Queen to assassinate the eldest son of the Emperor, Lenoret. He could not help but feel a little funny. He originally thought that the other party was targeting him, but now he thought that it was indeed full of loopholes. If the Dark-Scaled Naga wanted to find a land ally, how could they choose Anrek, who was like a stray dog? He instinctively thought that since the Grey Fin Naga had formed an alliance with him, then their enemy would naturally find their enemy. But he suddenly realized that his vision was too limited to Erewhon. The reality was that the Dark-Scaled Naga looked down on Anrek. What they needed was a strategic ally who could support them on land, not an enemy who would cause trouble for Brando. In this way, Cruz was indeed the best choice, and if the Silver Queen did have the ambition to unify Wond, she did indeed need a partner in the ocean. What's more, when Anrek appeared in the spiral hall, his first reaction was that the other party was here to assassinate him. But now that he thought about it, there were some problems. If the Dark-Scaled Naga wanted to deal with him, then the best choice should be in Tanajul. Because Tanajul was close to the sea, although it was said to be his base camp, the so-called master in this base camp was actually only his teacher Mephisto. But the Dark-Scaled Naga chose to go deep into the deadly frost forest. Not to mention how much trouble it would be for the sea lizards and Nagas to arrange an assassination plan deep into the inland. One must know that at that time Brando had Veronica, Mephisto, and Alaz, three masters by his side. These three were known to the outside world, so the Dark-Scaled Naga would not have no news at all. So, Anrek's appearance there could only be because of another purpose. What was the purpose? Of course it was not to help Anrek. The Dark-Scaled Naga was not a charity organization that would support the resistance group in Erewhon from thousands of miles away. One must know that this resistance group was related to All for One. But if the Dark-Scaled Naga had already formed an alliance with the Silver Queen, then this made sense. Anrek's target could only be the eldest prince of Cruz. Further to the conclusion, this unlucky lizardman sword saint was very likely caught red-handed by Veronica when he was ambushing the eldest prince. Veronica in history was naturally not Anrek's opponent, but after the Battle of the Loop of Trade Winds, the strength of the female army commander had grown very quickly, far surpassing her at the same time in the Amber Sword. So, Anrek thought that it would be foolproof, and in the end it was not surprising that it was caught off guard. In just a few breaths, Brando came to this conclusion. Since Veronica was so sure, it meant that Anrek must have confessed everything. After all, it was not a death warrior of Cruz, and it was unlikely that it would not let go. Brando crossed his hands and for the first time, seriously considered whether to agree to Veronica's request. He could help Veronica hide the news of their arrival in Tanajal, because as he said, it was just a small matter. But this time he had to think carefully. It was definitely an extremely dangerous thing to be involved in the battle for the succession of an empire. For supreme power, the nobles would do anything. In other words, his decision may involve the newborn Tanajal again in danger. Brando did not want to see Cruz's spies appear in the streets of Abes. But on the other hand, this was indeed an opportunity. Although if the news that the eldest prince was in Tanajal was leaked, it was very likely to anger the Silver Queen. But in fact, if the Silver Queen was determined to expand, then Erwin, who was close to the Cruz Empire, would bear the brunt. In reality, in the Cruz Empire he would first face the thunder of thunder from the Empire. But in fact, if Anrek used this opportunity to rope in the military and even some of the secular forces of the Cruz Empire, when the time comes, if Her Majesty wants to do things her way, then when the time comes, the Cruz Empire will be divided internally, and there may be a civil war. If that was the case, it would be too exciting. Brando simply wanted to laugh out loud in his dreams. Not to mention that there was also the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Although there was pressure from the dragons, there was resistance when there was oppression. How could the existence of a supreme existence like Vala be willing to be trampled on by others? The Queen ruled the Cruz Empire for 40 years, and he swallowed the humiliation for 40 years. Just when liberation was about to be seen, now that the dragons were interfering, it was simply intolerable. Brando felt that if he was in Vala's position, he would not be able to tolerate it. Although Vala was known to be wise and far-sighted, even a clay man has 3 points of temper. If the Holy Cathedral of Fire were to be impulsive, then the civil war in the Cruz Empire would be 70% certain. Brando was silent for a long time, repeatedly thinking about the details in the details. He was originally not good at these tricks, so he was very slow to think about it. However, Veronica and Mangrove did not seem to be in a hurry. Veronica sat down and took a sip from her teacup. Mangrove, on the other hand, had finally packed the tobacco and lit the fire. He took a deep puff and narrowed his eyes. He seemed to be enjoying it very much. The room was quiet for a while, and Amandina stared at the two people sitting opposite her lord. She seemed to have heard an extremely ridiculous story before, but this story had now involved all of them. There was no room for her to participate in such an important decision. In fact, she did not dare to speak, and could only wait silently for Brando to make a decision. Brando finally let out a long breath. Other than letting Prince Lenoret stay in Tanajal, what else do you plan to do? He asked a question. This already represented a change in attitude. Veronica put down the teacup, sighed softly and replied, "Not only His Royal Highness but also Shido and the Folded Sword Knights. Otherwise there will be too many people and the news will inevitably leak out. Although they are all students I trust, this matter is too important, and I don't need to let these young people bear the responsibility." You plan to go back to the Empire? Brando heard a hint of clues. Veronica nodded. If Shido and the others can't go back and I go back to the Empire alone, I will definitely bear the responsibility for the death of the first heir of the Empire and the destruction of the entire Folded Sword Knights. But it shouldn't be a big problem. The heir to the throne has to be prepared for all the unexpected when he goes out to experience the world. This is not unprecedented in the history of the Empire. The responsibility I will bear will only be that of improper command, and will not be aggravated by anger. Otherwise, no one in the Empire will dare to do anything in the future. Everyone understands this truth. The more you do, the more mistakes you make. She glanced at Mangrove. The 3 noble families in the north have all agreed that the military will do their best to protect me. I think I may be demoted, but I will keep my title. Her Majesty needs a trusted commander, and this is also part of our deal with her. But as long as Lenoret is still alive, there is still a chance for everything in the future. Brando glanced at Veronica with some pity. This female commander was considered an outstanding commander in the history of the empire. It would be a pity if she was left idle because of the internal transaction of the succession of the throne. But this was a good thing for Erwin, not to mention that he had a very small hope in his heart. Anyone could see that this commander and his teacher, the Sword of Mephisto, might have some unknown stories. If, and he meant if, in the future the Silver Queen stirred up trouble in the empire, and Veronica was left idle, maybe Erwin would have an outstanding duchess in the future. Although Veronica would certainly not be willing to fight with Cruz, Erwin did not only have Cruz as his opponent, but also Madara. In history, Veronica and Freya had a master-disciple relationship for a period of time, of course, during the period when the two countries were at their best. And if the two could re-establish this relationship in this period of history, and the two goddesses of war, one old and one young, would appear on the battlefield against Madara at the same time. Brando was simply excited at the thought of it, but he still said, "But have you two considered a problem? What if the situation is not as you expect? What if the eldest prince does not return to the empire, and Her Majesty the Empress designates another heir?" Sitting on the sofa, he slowly said these words behind the veil of smoke, appearing very mysterious. Veronica and Mangrove exchanged glances. From their expressions it could be seen that the two Empire Legion commanders had considered this question before, but the answer they gave was, "What do you think?" They still had to take a gamble. "His Highness the Prince himself agrees?" Veronica nodded slowly. Brendel understood that it was the Lizardmen Sword Saints' verbal evidence that gave them great confidence. Indeed, the Red Ring Lizardmen had always had nothing to do with the Kurlutz people, and the sphere of influence of both sides did not intertwine with each other. There was really no need for them to slander the Queen of the Empire. Brando lowered his eyelids and pondered for a moment. Then he raised his head again as if he had made up his mind and said, "Let's discuss the details." The female commander's eyes were filled with surprise. Of course, she knew how difficult it was for Brando to make such a decision. This matter had nothing to do with him, and this young man probably made such a decision because of their relationship. This made her feel both ashamed and touched. Ever since the incident at the Loop of Trade Winds, it seemed that this young man had been helping her, and she, as his elder, had been causing trouble for him. Thinking of this, Veronica's gaze towards Brando became much friendlier. It was somewhat like a real elder looking at her own family's younger generation. She sighed, feeling a little ashamed, but she did not know that the whole thing was completely different from what she had imagined. In her mind, an outstanding talent like Brando would always be able to obtain the status of a noble no matter how the situation changed. If he served the empire in the future, his status might even be higher than it was today. In the eyes of nobles like her, the power of royalty and the power of local nobles were separated. Erwin's fate was the fate of the Erwin royal family, and the rise and fall of Erwin had nothing to do with local nobles like Brando. That was the truth. But Veronica would never have dreamed that Brando's kingdom of Erwin was based on the concept of nationality. The Count's considerations were based on the interests of the entire Erwin, so he agreed to this request. In fact, it was a beneficial and harmless hindrance to Tanajal's interests, but it was a more beneficial choice for the entire kingdom. In the eyes of outsiders, Brando suffered a great loss, but Brando himself felt that he had profited greatly. Brando certainly noticed the change in Veronica's attitude at this time. He also wondered why the female commander would suddenly be so moved, but this was a good opportunity for him. Although it had been confirmed that Prince Lenoret would be given political asylum, there were too many details in it that were worth deliberating. He had to fight for the best compensation for himself. "I have a request," he said. "The entire Folded Sword Knight Regiment will stay in Tanajal. This is naturally a last resort, but the problem is that this is a knight regiment. They are all young and energetic and there are many of them. If no one manages them, I'm afraid they will become a hidden danger sooner or later. What's more, Tanajal is not their hometown after all. To let these young people live in anonymity thousands of miles away from their hometown for reasons that have nothing to do with their own interests, this is a bit too much." He looked at Veronica and interrupted her unfinished words. "I understand, Madam Commander. You want to say that they are soldiers and soldiers have to obey orders. But soldiers are also people, and now that they have taken off their uniforms, it will only take a while for them to forget order and glory. Without a sense of glory they are nothing." Veronica could not help but shut her mouth after hearing this. She had to admit that what Brando said was very reasonable. She was indeed taking things for granted. Mangrove nodded. He had been in the army for a long time, so he understood the logic of the young man in front of him. He put down his pipe and replied, "What the Count said is right. How do you think we should solve this problem?" I hope they can take off Cruz's uniform and join my army. As long as they stay in the land of Erewhon, they should swear allegiance to me and Prince Leneret at the same time, Brando replied. Erewhon is going through a drastic change, and there is a place for these young people to show their skills. What's more, the army is a huge collective. Even if such a group is integrated into this collective, it will be difficult for the outside world to know about it. This can also minimize the risk of news leakage. On the contrary, the appearance of hundreds of people in any other place may attract the attention of people with ulterior motives. The most important thing is that these young people will have the opportunity to train in this land. I guarantee that when they return to Cruz in the future, you will get a group of experienced generals, not a group of resentful and useless young people. When Prince Leneret returns to the Empire one day, these young people who have sworn allegiance to him will become his right-hand men. Brando stopped his short speech and looked at the reaction of the two corps commanders in front of him. Mangrove nodded, but Brando suspected that his last sentence had moved the old soldier. Veronica hesitated for a moment. After a while, she said to him seriously, "But you have to promise me that you will protect them. Each of them is my favorite student." "Just like how I protect Freya," Brando replied. "They are Freya's comrades and also my comrades." Veronica nodded her head in satisfaction. "You are a very good lobbyist. You can consider a career in politics. It's hard for you to deal with us soldiers." Mangrove finally concluded. He bit the pipe and blew a smoke ring. Brendel's heart was filled with ecstasy. Success. Now he had a group of gold-ranked officers, the most outstanding group of Kurlut's star officers in the future. They were now under his command. Not to mention whether the Empire would fall into civil war in the future. Just such a gain was enough to wake him up from his dreams with a smile. P.S. The second update is still 5,500 words. This weekend's extra update ends here. I wish you all the best in your work and studies next week. What, you're asking me if I missed anything? Do you see the cross and the pile of firewood over there? Chapter 847. The carriage was as quiet as it was when they left. Amandina sat opposite him, and Brando opened his mouth to ask, "Amandina, what do you think of this matter?" Amandina did not speak immediately. The impact of this matter was too great for her, and it took her a moment to recover from the unreal dizziness. She replied as calmly as possible, "I think it's a little too hasty, my lord. At the very least, you should wait until after the battle with Randner before agreeing to this matter. To be honest, this matter at hand has more advantages than disadvantages for Erewhon in the future. But with your current status, it seems a little inappropriate. Although Her Highness may not be suspicious, gossip is a fearful thing. If it falls into the eyes of someone with ulterior motives, it will be a sign of your domineering future. Today is different from the past. My lord, you must pay attention to your relationship with Her Highness." Amandina lowered her long eyelashes, and when she answered, her voice was very soft and seemed to be rational. Her answer surprised Brando. Amandina was so old-fashioned and cute in his heart. He originally thought that once this noble lady reacted, she would teach him a lesson with a straight face. Today's situation was not easy to come by. He should not easily put his territory in danger because of his own willfulness, because with Amandina's personality she would definitely do it. As long as it was for his sake, then she would definitely be serious. But she didn't. The layout and wisdom in Miss Amandina's heart were far beyond his expectations. She had even seen through the layout and true meaning of his arrangement. Her words were something he had never thought of before. He had been so focused on the layout that he had almost forgotten the most important thing, the human heart. Brando looked at his own Amandina, his heart full of curiosity. It was as if he saw a noble lady who followed behind him step by step, and even haggled with the people for the festival of spring plowing and autumn planting. In the blink of an eye, she suddenly became a figure similar to Oberway and Makarov who could really give advice to a superior. Could it be that this noble lady could also level up? He looked at her, his heart full of surprise as if he had found a treasure. "What is it, my lord?" Amandina felt a little uneasy under Brendel's burning gaze, but she was not Scarlet or Freya. She could only blush and avert her gaze. She still remembered her duty as his aide. Even though her heart was pounding, she forced herself to remain calm and asked seriously, "Call me Brando." Amandina opened her mouth and her face turned red. "Is there any way to remedy this?" Brando asked again. He suddenly realized that it was very interesting to disturb the thoughts of Ms. Amandina and then watch her try to remain calm. Amandina, of course, did not notice her lord's bad taste. She took a light breath and nodded. "At least inform Her Highness and tell her what happened." After all, this matter was entrusted to you by Lady Veronica. Your choice is understandable. She should understand your painstaking efforts. Brendel nodded and looked back at the scenery outside the window. The carriage was passing by a shady road outside Port Gris, and the sunlight that penetrated through the branches of the trees was divided into golden fragments and shadows that were moving at high speed. He thought for a moment and withdrew his gaze. He looked at Sheeta, who was sitting beside him and rubbing his itch. The dragon had just finished eating the pastries Amandina prepared for him, and his mouth was full of crumbs. He was checking the drawer under the table to see if there were any leftovers. Stop looking, there's nothing left. Sheeta, let me ask you a question. Have you heard of the names Silver Queen or Constance? Brando asked. The little fat dragon closed the drawer with some frustration and asked back, Who is that? This reaction was expected by Brando, so he asked again, Then have you heard of any treasure in the dragon clan that can rejuvenate people? Rejuvenation. Sheeta wiped his mouth with his sleeve, rubbing all the crumbs on his mouth onto his expensive vest shirt. There are many of these things. The fountain of youth is priceless to you mortals, but we have several of them. Yes, Allah's has one. Brando noticed that Amandina's eyes lit up slightly, and couldn't help but sigh in his heart. He knew that Amandina must be thinking about the little female dragon's treasure. Girls really can't avoid this kind of gimmick of eternal youth, even the old-fashioned noble ladies are no exception. But he shook his head. I'm not talking about this kind of rejuvenation but the real one. Not only the face but even the insides of the body are glowing with youth, a treasure that allows people to return to the heyday of their youth. Sheeta's hand that was wiping his mouth froze, and he replied subconsciously, How can such a thing exist? If there really is such a thing, our dragon clan would be an immortal race. It's not to the extent of immortality, even if it only works once. Is there such a thing? No. Sheeta shook his head like a rattledrum. This has already violated the most basic law of Martha. He looked at Brando again and said with some disbelief, My lord, I see that you are still young, you should cherish the present, there is no need to pursue these illusory things. I heard that the kings among you humans who pursue immortality are all muddle-headed and incompetent tyrants, but if you really want to, I can recommend you to go to Madara and ask those skeletons for advice. Scram. Brando kicked him. Then he turned back and said to Amandina, Write a letter. To Her Royal Highness, Summer left and autumn came. This sentence was suitable for the current Vero. It had only been a week since Freya arrived at Fort Valendon, and the emerald green of summer outside the castle was dyed with a tinge of yellow. Griffin stood in the corridor, her silver eyes reflecting the rolling hills of the Ghan Mountains. The autumn wind had already picked up, and the maidservants behind her had already draped a shawl over her shoulders. The thick and warm fur shawl contrasted against the princess's delicate appearance, but she stood upright, just like her father, grandfather and great-grandfather. The mountain wind that was called Charmin blew the silver hair on her forehead. The princess opened the letter in her hand, and the paper fluttered in the wind. Her fingertips were slightly pale, and there was a ball of anger in her heart. She read the letter again word by word and could not help but crumple it into a ball. The princess's actions frightened the maidservants behind her, and one of them asked carefully, Your Royal Highness? Nothing, it's about that despicable Count Randner. Griffin felt like there was a piece of paper in her heart, and on it was written Brando's name. She used a knife to poke at it again and again. That despicable bastard, but she did not dare to say it out loud. If news of her falling out with Count Tonagel were to spread, she could not imagine how big of a disaster it would be for the South that had just stabilized. Her grandfather could not help her much. After all, Duke Vero was first and foremost a duke, and a noble of the kingdom. Do you want to invite Lord Oberway or Count Randner over? The maidservant asked carefully. She thought that the letter contained military intelligence from the south, but she did not dare to make any more guesses. After all, she was just a maidservant. Griffin knew that the count her maidservant was referring to was Audine, and she shook her head in annoyance. There's no need, it's not a big deal. She then looked at the crumpled paper in her hand. She wanted to throw it on the ground and stomp on it, but after a moment of hesitation, she peeled it back and flattened it. The letter had become wrinkled and was no longer flat, just like the image of the once flawless knight in her mind. It could no longer return to the dreamy vision of a young girl at the beginning. Griffin suddenly felt a sense of bitterness in her heart. Why was everyone like this? Makarov, Grandmaster Fleetwood, Arek, and even this despicable bastard in front of her. Could it be that there was no one in the great Erewhon that she could trust? But she did not dare to reveal such a thing to outsiders. Every word in Brando's letter was heavy, and it weighed heavily on her chest. How audacious of him to involve himself in the matter of the empire's succession, and then act first and report later. Griffin bit her lower lip until it turned white. Even Brando acting first and reporting later was not as hateful to her. But did that bastard know how terrible it would be if he angered the Empire? This was the dragon's reverse scale, and anyone who touched it would die. Griffin did not dare to let Oberway and Audine discuss this matter. Even though Oberway was her teacher and core ally, he was not someone she could completely trust. Fortunately, Oberway was also clear about this bottom line and did not say anything more. Griffin was smart, and most of the time she did not need further reminders. Count Audine was not as sensitive as her teacher when it came to politics, but he was loyal to the Empire, so she could rest assured. However, none of them were the most suitable candidates for the position of internal minister in her heart. Griffin did not know why, but there was always a detestable shadow in her heart. Griffin simply put away the letter and walked towards her study. "Your Highness." The maidservants were confused. "I'm going to write a reply." Only 5 days later, Griffin received a second letter from Tanajil. This letter was different from the first letter, which was a formal report. The letter explained in detail the ins and outs of providing political asylum to Prince Lenoret, as well as some of Brando's own considerations, as well as the troubles and benefits that he might face by doing so. Griffin sat at her desk, stroking Brando's apology on the letter with her fingertips, and sat in a daze for a while. "It seems that I have wronged him," she thought to herself. "But he promised Veronica, and there is no benefit to his own territory. Is it just to get rid of himself?" But this time the half-elf girl carefully checked that the magic seal on the letter was intact, gently folded the letter, and carefully kept it in a box made of mithril. Only she and Haruz had the key to that box, and it was a birthday gift from Oberg VII. No matter where she went, she would take this box with her. After that she wrote a reply. The first half of the reply was full of comfort and encouragement from a regent princess to her vassal, and expressed that she did not care about this matter, and hoped that Brando would not have any grudges. But at the end of the letter, Griffin wrote in beautiful words, "Count, although it may be rude to speak so boldly, I still want to ask you what you think about the future of this kingdom, and the relationship between me, Haruz, and the kingdom and you in the future. I hope that a kind and righteous knight I have met can answer this question." When Brando received the letter, he could not help but laugh. The princess seemed to have no way to deal with him, and she actually played the tender card. But he had no ambition, and when he received the letter, he only had the belief to press forward. He had no other words, and immediately replied to the princess. The letter did not contain a single word, only a blank page, and then he placed the brooch that Griffin had given him on the blank page. A week later he received a reply. There was only one sentence in the letter. "Mr. Brando, please do as you wish. Erwin's future, together with Haruz, is in your hands." The forest rustled. Princess Magadol lay quietly on the large bed that seemed to have grown naturally from the walls of the trees. Her blonde hair was spread over the snow-white sheets, and her eyelids were closed quietly, like a sleeping beauty in a fairy tale. But everyone in the room could already feel that the princess had regained her breath. Her chest was rising and falling slightly, and her long eyelashes would occasionally tremble, as if she would wake up at any time. Brando breathed a sigh of relief. He first gave a look to the others, indicating that the Shire, Hipamera, Sheeta, and the twin sisters should leave first. Then he turned around and thanked the cold-faced girl behind him. "It's all thanks to you, Miss Farofa." Sheeta had hidden the dragon's heart in another nest in the deadly tundra, but it was completely destroyed in the explosion. The one that was placed on Magadol's body was brought over by Alaz from the dragon clan. Although the little female dragon was careless, she was a woman of her word. It was just that she was supposed to personally implant the dragon's heart into Magadol, but she could not leave because of her confinement period. In the end, she entrusted the cold-faced girl from the dragon clan to fulfill her promise. And Brando happened to meet her once in the Legacy of the Saint, the girl that Alaz called Farofa. He was originally worried about whether there would be any problems, but he did not expect the latter to be so much more reliable than the former. Not only was the entire implantation process clean, but it also seemed that there were no problems at all. Therefore his gratitude was also sincere. Ever since the Battle of Ampere Seal, he saw Princess Magadol as a friend. If not for them, the princess would not have ended up like this. Every time he thought of the night when Princess Magadol braved the rain to gather information, but was discovered and then executed, he felt very sad. The nun princess must have been terrified and desperate at that time, but for the sake of her friendship with Princess Griffin, she did not hesitate to go. In this era of Erwin, the friendship between Magadal and Griffin could be said to be the most shining light of humanity in the darkness. It was a pity that such a gentle and kind girl did not have a good ending in history. Furofa's appearance was still the same as the last time he met her. She looked at Princess Magadal on the bed, then turned back to look at Brando. She did not speak but only stretched out her hand and opened her palm. What does this mean? Brando was slightly stunned. Earrings. Furofa's voice was like water dripping on ice. Brando's little bit of goodwill towards Alaz that he had just built up in his heart disappeared in an instant. He could not help but scold the little female dragon again and again in his heart. It seemed that ever since he met her, she had been thinking of ways to set a series of traps for him, and now the biggest time bomb was right beside him, ticking away, and he had completely forgotten about it. But this was not the core of the problem. Furofa's earrings had long been damaged in the last battle of Ampere Seal. How could he take them out now? He mustered up his courage to look at the cold-faced dragon girl, and then remembered what Alaz and Shido said about the symbolism of the dragon's earrings. He could not help but blush. Fortunately, after experiencing so many things, he was finally able to learn how to be thick-skinned like other nobles. After hesitating for a while, he replied, "That, Miss Furofa, your earrings, I was a little too careless and lost them." The dragon girl looked at him coldly. Brando felt as if there was a sharp sword hanging over his head that could fall at any time. I think, he stammered, "actually, I think that a person's marriage shouldn't be related to an item. Although local customs are also very important, but, you see, you're a dragon and I'm a human. We have to abide by our own customs. You should be able to understand what I mean, Miss Furofa. Actually, before that, I didn't know at all." In fact, it was not that Brando could not fight with a young dragon like Alaz or even Furofa, but he felt that he was in the wrong first. If he were to fight, then as a lord he would probably lose all his face. With such thoughts in his mind, his momentum was naturally lower than the dragon girl in front of him. Furofa listened for a moment with a cold face and then said faintly, "You mean you don't want to marry me?" F***ck. Brando looked at her with his mouth agape, not understanding how she understood the meaning of his words. He opened his mouth and after a long while, he squeezed out a sentence. "This? I'm afraid that's not what I meant." The dragon girl glanced at him, and her eyes became unprecedentedly cold, making Brando feel as if he was already a dead man in her eyes. "I didn't expect you to be this kind of person, Mr. Count. I hate those who play with the hearts of young girls the most. You're on your own." With that, she turned around, opened the door, walked out, and slammed the door shut, leaving Brendel standing there with a puzzled look on his face. Brendel was about to go crazy. "Alas, what have you done, you bastard?" he roared in his heart. Chapter 848. The fog parted the surface of the sea, and a protruding protrusion gradually appeared in front of them. A ray of light pierced through the fog and shone on the side of the Bisca. The sailors on the deck recognized it as a navigation light and hurriedly raised the sails. The first mate gave a signal to the helmsman to turn the rudder while waiting for the pilot ship to approach. Captain Dalen stood behind the third mast with a pipe in his mouth, wearing a wet trench coat. He squinted his eyes and took a look. He turned around and gave a look to a sailor beside him. The sailor hurriedly ran down the deck and went straight to the third level of the cabin. Grey Harbor was just ahead. When Viscount Bernie received the news, he immediately informed Babarn and Boymare. In fact, the two had already deduced this information from the sailors running up and down the aisles. At the moment, fist-sized rats were scurrying around the aisles of the cabin, but no one had the time to care about these annoying uninvited guests. Several cabin doors were open, and the wind from the deck poured in like a waterfall down the stairs. The smell of the sea assaulted their nostrils and the cabin below was a mess. Viscount Bernie led Babarn and Boymare forward against the sailors who were rushing out. The three of them did not say a word, and their faces were dark as if they were carved from the same mold. The three of them walked until they came to a wooden door locked by iron chains at the bottom of the cabin. Viscount Bernie turned around and exchanged a look with his two imperial colleagues. He took out the key from his coat, and the key on the iron ring rattled. He grabbed the lock and opened it with a click. After the iron chain lost its restraint, it fell into the puddles of water on the aisles like a dead snake. But the three of them did not even look at it and pushed the door open. Behind the door was an idle warehouse. Many empty barrels and wooden boxes were piled up outside, but at the innermost part, there was a whole piece of golden crystal covered by a curtain. Viscount Bernie looked at the black curtain that was already submerged in water and asked, "Is everything ready?" Babarn and Boymare nodded in unison. The fleet had to cross the Longhorn Strait and enter the Silver Bay controlled by the Temple of the Earth. Although the naval strength of the Temple of the Earth was almost negligible in front of the Empire, Viscount Bernie did not dare to take this risk. He chose a more reliable land route, which was to disembark from Grey Harbor and cross the Black Blade Fortress to return to the Empire. This journey would take about a week, and after returning to the Empire, it would take another month to reach Rushta. However, the risk was much lower than the sea. Currently, the northern part of Erewhon was still controlled by the traditional noble forces of the kingdom, and the Empire still had a lot of influence in these areas. Thinking of this, Viscount Bernie couldn't help but sigh at the bad influence brought about by the Battle of Ampere Seal. If it weren't for the mistake of the Cecil family, the Empire wouldn't have completely lost control of the southern part of Erewhon. What lay in front of him now was the last checkpoint of the royal family of Erewhon in the north, the home port of the First Royal Fleet, Grey Harbor. The harbor officer had been bribed, but how to transport such a large piece of crystal off the ship without attracting attention was a troublesome problem. The best way would be to break the crystal and get the person and gun out of it. However, he tried once with his own sword a few days ago. The magic sword bounced off the surface of the crystal and broke into 3 pieces before it even touched the surface. He spent thousands of Cruz gold coins to buy the silver-grade sword from a small noble. He also used some tricks, but he didn't expect it to die before it could be used. He didn't have time to feel heartache. Although the hardness of the crystal was beyond his expectations, he still had hope. Boymare had already told him that Babarn had his family's heirloom, the silver dragon's throat. That fantasy-grade weapon might be able to break the surface of the crystal. He looked for Babarn, who was a little hesitant at first. It seemed like he was worried about hurting the woman inside, but Viscount Bernie was a little disdainful. If they could successfully complete this mission when they returned to the Empire, what could they not have in terms of status and women? Why did he have to be obsessed with a mountain woman? Fortunately, Babarn didn't seem too inflexible. After some persuasion, he finally nodded and agreed. At this time he turned to look at Babarn. Babarn didn't seem to hesitate. He took out the silver crossbow and began to load it, then raised it and pointed at the crystal covered by the curtain. Viscount Bernie nodded with some appreciation, thinking that this was a man who did things without hesitation. Compared to him, Boymare was much worse. He was too timid. Thinking of this, he looked at the ladder. At this time, Boymare seemed to wake up from a dream and hurried up to lift the curtain. Viscount Bernie saw this scene and couldn't help but sigh in his heart. This guy had already put himself in the position of the weakest of the 3. In the future, even if he did contribute, he would not be the first. In fact, he and Babarn should have had the same opportunity. This was how character determined fate. Babarn raised the crossbow and pulled the trigger with a bang. A silver light shot towards the smooth surface of the crystal. Before anyone could react, the silver light suddenly reversed at a speed 1,000 times faster and pierced through Babarn's right arm holding the crossbow, shattering the bones of his right hand. Then the silver light drilled into Babarn's chest like a fish and came out from his back. With a bang, it nailed itself to the wooden planks behind the cabin. The blood-stained tail feathers were still buzzing and shaking. Babarn's jaw dropped, his light blue eyes showing the light of despair and unwillingness. He stared at the girl sleeping like a princess in the crystal, and then with that expression, he fell backward like a piece of wood. With a splash, he fell into the water, and then the water in the cabin was dyed a layer of light red. It all happened so suddenly that Boymare was almost stunned. Viscount Bernie's face was gloomy. He raised his head and looked at the crystal. There was not even a trace of a flaw on the surface of the crystal. "What are you doing? Help Sir Babarn out." He gritted his teeth and reprimanded. "Help? Help where?" Boymare's face was pale. He wanted to say that Babarn was obviously dead. Viscount Bernie looked at him with disappointment and said in a low voice, "Sir Babarn died for his country. Do you want his body to be soaked in the water like this?" Only then did Boymare realize what was going on. He hurriedly grabbed Babarn's shoulders and dragged him out of the water, dragging him into the cabin. "Don't stop." Viscount Bernie saw that Boymare wanted to take Babarn's body back to the lower cabin and stopped him. He wanted to stab the idiot to death. "Don't take him back. Take his body to the first-class cabin. Are you a stupid pig?" At this time, a sailor passed by Babarn's body and Boymare. He looked at the two strangely, then came to Viscount Bernie's side and asked in a low voice, "Viscount, the port has sent someone to tell us to stop outside the chain and prepare for inspection. Tell them that this is the diplomatic fleet of the Kurlutz Empire, and they won't accept inspection from other countries. Also tell them to prepare a doctor or a priest. Tell them that some of our people died fighting against the pirates, and we need to arrange a dignified funeral. We can't leave the warriors of the Kurlutz Empire on foreign soil. Go tell them that. Viscount Bernie replied calmly. The sailor was a little surprised. Fighting the pirates? But he looked at Boymer and Babarn and suddenly understood. He quickly nodded and ran out. Wait, Viscount Bernie called the sailor at the stairs. Go prepare a chest. A chest, Viscount, how big do you want it? The sailor stood barefoot in the rushing water on the stairs and turned back to ask. Very big, used to store horses. We don't have that kind of chest on the ship, Viscount. We can only ask the port to prepare it. Then tell them that we have captured a gift for Her Majesty and ask them to help prepare it. Will that do, Viscount? That will do. Go. Viscount Bernie nodded. He waited until the sailor ran up to the deck before he turned back to look at the giant crystal one last time. A thought flashed through his mind. Could it be that only a divine artifact can open this thing? It had been 2 days since Flora left without saying goodbye. During that time, Princess Magadal had woken up once. Brando was waiting in New Valhalla for the arrival of the young men of the Folded Sword Knights and the eldest son of King Cruz. But it seemed that Veronica had a lot of things to take care of. She and Mangrove had yet to depart from Port Gree. The reports from the north and south were piled up on his desk in the great hall of the Valhalla tree. Most of these reports were on the surface. Brando looked at a few of them. They were nothing more than the movements of the northern nobles. Some of them mentioned that Count Randner had completed his mobilization work. Someone had witnessed an army leaving Magadan and heading south. The long-prepared war in the south was imminent. The allied forces of Anthony and Vero were heading south. As for the direction of their march, it was still a secret. Brando looked up at the map of Erewhon hanging on the wall. His gaze swept across the Mal Lowell area. Judging from the time, the army should have already entered the area. Count Randner and Bloodstaff were still ignorant of their future and fate. They did not understand what was waiting for them in front of them. The war was only waiting for an opportunity, and that opportunity was the day when Tanagel's army would depart. But Brando was also waiting for the arrival of a critical moment. Before that moment he would not act rashly. Other news mentioned the unusual movements of the undead in the direction of Butchie. These were all within Brando's expectations. In fact, the information that was sent to him was even less than what he knew. Tanagel's intelligence system was built on the first batch of adventurers from Tanagel and a group of people from the Red Bronze Dragon mercenaries. These people had gone through several selections. After the war with Tanagel, the remaining elites were mostly loyal and reliable to him. However, their abilities were still slightly weaker. Among them, the ones in Ampere Seal were the most outstanding, and the ones in the north were slightly weaker. As for the news from Madara and Cruz, it was purely groundless. However, Erewhon's civil war was no longer the most difficult enemy in front of him. On the contrary, the shadow of the undead in the south was getting stronger day by day. That was Erewhon's greatest enemy. The Cruz Empire in the north was also getting restless. Brando began to feel that his intelligence network was getting weaker and weaker. First of all, he still needed talents. Not only did they have to be loyal and reliable, but they also had to have outstanding abilities. Amandina, the Shire, Freya, and even the Roman were not talents in this area. But Brando suddenly thought of someone, Sue. Her performance in Ampere Seal was impressive. She was calm and composed, and her mind was unusually clear. She was also not easily swayed by emotions. Such a person was simply a natural talent and intelligence. Although Brando did not have any talent in this area, it did not stop him from discovering talents. Maybe I should find time to ask her to come over from the Shire. As he thought about it, he placed the documents he had read page by page at the bottom. After reading more than 10 pages, he frowned again. This day there was still no news of Scarlet. The mountain girl seemed to have really disappeared from this world. Ever since he saw her for the last time that day in the Spiral Hall, there had been no news of her. Even in the civilized areas around the deadly frost forest, no one had seen a girl with similar characteristics. Brando suddenly felt a little annoyed. He put down the information heavily. It had been half a month. In the early days, he could still comfort himself that nothing would happen to Scarlet. But now, such an excuse was getting weaker and weaker. Sometimes, Brando even wondered if Scarlet had decided to leave him. Or could it be that she had temporarily lost her memory due to the intense shock from the explosion? Not only were these hypotheses ridiculous, but they also could not explain the fact that no one had seen Scarlet after that. Could it be that Milo's myth was really lying to them? But this did not seem to be necessary for a god. He stood up from his seat and then sat down again. His fingers tapped on the table again and again. For a moment he almost wanted to go back to the deadly frost forest himself, but he also knew that it was futile. He had a faint premonition that Scarlet might not be in the deadly frost forest anymore. She might have left even earlier. But as for why no one had seen her, Brando still had some doubts. He could only ask Lantern Island to help him expand the search area. In fact, Duke Cananon was already a little puzzled as to why he was so obsessed with a maid, but Brando did not care about it. At this time someone finally opened the door. Brando looked up and saw Ko Hua in a white dress. She had long white hair and light silver eyes. She was the younger sister of the two sisters, the kind-hearted Ko Hua. Behind her was the impatient elder sister. Dark Ko Hua glanced at him with her blood-red eyes. Her eyes were full of provocation. In fact, Brando had no doubt that if she had the chance she would pounce on him directly and bite him with her sharp canine teeth. That kind of hatred was undisguised. His gaze passed over the sisters and finally fell on Maynard. Senior, no, Miss Knight had been able to walk a few days ago. Now she was helping him with some things in Valhalla that could be considered as rehabilitation training. Her injuries healed very quickly, which made Brando suspect that this lady seemed to have some special abilities. Maynard also glanced at him, her indifferent eyes saying, "I've called her here for you." Brando nodded to her to show his gratitude. Then he looked at the Ko Hua sisters. "Count, we meet again today," the kind-hearted Ko Hua replied with a smile. This quiet girl was always so polite. And her elder sister ended the greeting with a light snort. Brando did not mind. He asked the Ko Hua sisters to come today to determine their relationship with Valhalla and his territory. In the final battle of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator, Dark Ko Hua ultimately abandoned Milo's divine spark and chose to preserve her own soul imprint. She did not choose to die with the body and divine fire of the giant god. Her current state should be a product between a heroic spirit and some kind of law existence. But this state was not something unacceptable to her, because it was one of the ways in which the Twilight Seed appeared in this world. But the problem was that no matter which way Dark Ko Hua and kind-hearted Ko Hua existed in the world, in fact, they had already changed the history that Brando was familiar with. Ekis' eldest daughter survived, so it was hard to say whether her other daughters' endings would be the same as in history, and whether her own ending would be the same as in the game. Brando faintly felt that he had touched another line in the world of Wond. The change in the history and fate of the Cruz Empire was the beginning. So even though the trip to the deadly frost forest had come to an end, he still could not decide how to deal with the sisters. He looked at the twin sisters and temporarily put the annoyance in his heart to the back of his mind. He asked, "Miss Ko Hua, have you gotten used to living in my territory during this time?" "Count's territory is peaceful. The people live and work in peace and are far away from disputes. I like it very much. Also, the scenery in Valhalla is beautiful. I am very honored to be able to live in this legendary stronghold. There is nothing I am dissatisfied with." Kind-hearted Ko Hua smiled and replied sincerely. Dark Ko Hua looked at her sister. She was very disappointed with her sister's weak personality. She pouted and said, Anyway, I said that I am not happy living here, but you still won't let me go. Hypocrite, annoying person." "You are right, Miss Ko Hua. Do you still remember what I told you before? I am taking a big risk by not killing you. You should understand that you are a part of Dusk. Your existence is a kind of hostility to the civilized world. But you are kind-hearted. I don't want to kill an innocent person because of a possibility that is not in line with my ideals. But as a responsible person, I hope that you will not leave the range of my protection, okay?" Brando asked. Kind-hearted Ko Hua nodded. "I completely understand, Count." Brando looked at the girl whose mind was as pure as a clear lake. He couldn't help but be startled. Was this really the eldest daughter of the legendary Ekis? This kind of purity and kindness was enough to make most humans feel ashamed of themselves. Even he couldn't help but restrain his own suspicions. However, this was a matter of great importance. Brando naturally wouldn't change his mind because of a moment of emotion. He calmed down and looked at Dark Ko Hua. Dark Ko Hua was slightly taller than her sister. Brando thought that this might be a reflection of her strong personality in her soul. She looked at Brando with contempt with her blood-red eyes. "Is this why Count invited us here? What a superfluous move. My sister and I are now weak and powerless girls. Count, you could have put us under house arrest here with one order. Not to mention that even if you wanted to unleash your beastly nature at this moment, we wouldn't be able to resist, so there's really no need to hypocritically ask for our consent here." Brando was almost angered to death by this girl. What did she mean by weak and powerless girls? Kind-hearted Ko Hua's strength had been recovering day by day after leaving the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. Now she was almost at the peak of elemental activation. and she had suffered heavy losses because of stealing Milo's divinity. He was afraid that she wouldn't be able to recover in a short period of time. This was purely her own fault. But now it seemed that this young lady had pushed all the blame onto him. He couldn't help but squint at the latter and replied lightly, "I'm afraid you've made a mistake. What you said just now was to your sister. As for you, Miss Ko-hwa, as a war criminal and captive, naturally you can't enjoy the same high standard of treatment as your sister." Dark Ko-hwa frowned slightly and asked with some concern, "What do you mean? You took my things, so naturally you can only do things for me to pay off the debt." Brando replied. Ko-hwa's eyes widened. Her beautiful blood-red eyes stared at him in surprise. "When did I take your things?" Brando shook his head. Looking at this girl, he couldn't help but think of everything that had happened back then. Chapter 849. She must be judged, Lord Milos. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost because of her, in Toquinin, Lasca. They have nothing to do with me because I have not seen it with my own eyes. I cannot even empathize with their sorrow, but I think if I have such an opportunity in front of me and do nothing, then I will become an accomplice, and I cannot accept that as a human being. This is not for revenge but for justice, because no one can escape responsibility for their mistakes. Brando lay in Freya's arms, looking up at the tall phantom in front of him, and answered calmly. The platform floated in a pure black world, surrounded by a square of light. The flashing blue lightning separated the inside from the outside world, and the violent energy turbulence raged in the outside world, but it could not affect the world inside the light at all. In terms of the purity of divine power, Milos was thousands of times better than Dark Ko-hwa. Milos shook his head heavily and said in a rumbling voice, "You killed her, and the other Ko-hwa will die because of it. She is innocent." Brando frowned, wondering if this was true. Dark Ko-hwa's crimes were unforgivable, but if the other Ko-hwa was responsible for what she did, it was not unreasonable on a certain level, but it was a little too barbaric. Their swords were thrown aside, and the Lionheart sword was stacked on top of Haoran Gaia, the dark edge of the sword and the silver of the blade reflecting each other. Brando turned his head and saw Ko-hwa, who was a little further away, pale as a sheet, lying weakly in a pool of blood. Her ebony hair spread out on the platform like an offering. She seemed to have foreseen her end, but her blood-red eyes were still staring at him with hatred, and the resentment in them was too deep to be resolved. Veronica's weak voice was heard. "But she is not innocent. She and this guy are two sides of the same coin. When she separated her dark soul, she should have realized this. If one day she is judged for the sins of the other side of her, it is not against common sense." Her voice was as deep as water, and it was not difficult to hear the burning anger in her tone. Lasca, which was destroyed by Dim Korfa, was a city under the rule of the Empire. No one would be able to remain calm when their country was attacked like this, let alone a female army commander. "Indeed," Milos replied in a rumbling voice. "But she does not deserve to die." "Does not deserve to die?" "She only fulfilled my will. If it was me who woke up and not her, the result would still be the same. She is a willful little girl, and although she has done some wrong, she does not deserve to die." "If that's the case, then those hundreds of thousands of lives deserve to die, Lord Milos?" Veronica asked angrily. Brando could not help but look at the commander with some admiration. The person in front of her was a real god, and she dared to question him in such a tone. The so-called strength of the Empire soldiers was probably nothing more than this. The goddess of war of the Cruz people had never let down those who trusted her. Milos sighed. "Letting the gods return to this world is a mistake in itself. Perhaps it is too cold in your eyes, but the awakeners must fulfill that promise. The feelings of mortals are precious, but unfortunately I cannot understand them. I cherish these ordinary things, so I do not want to see that kind of thing happen. But since it has happened, someone must be responsible for it. But that person is not Ko-hwa. It is meaningless to vent your anger, and it will not let the dead rest in peace." Brando did not answer. He had already expected this. "In my eyes, this new world is humble, ignorant, full of mistakes and impurity. It is not as glorious as the order of the ancient times, nor is it as inspiring as the Golden Age and the Silver Age," Milos replied with a rumbling voice. "But in your eyes, it is precious, and that is enough. You still have a tomorrow, and that is hope. So cherish it and warn others not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Bury the old order and the gods in history forever. You no longer need us." His voice grew louder and louder, like thunder intertwined in midair. But the thunder rolled and eventually faded away. Some kind of law in the space completely collapsed and disappeared. "Lord Milos?" Veronica frowned and noticed something. He approved of Freya's choice. Brando replied softly. Mortals could not kill gods after all, but Milos kept the promise. When Erek and the others made their choice, he returned to this world. Forced by the promise with Alphonse and the crystal, he had to destroy the current order and rebuild the glory since the ancient times. Whether it was through Corfa's hand or someone else's, Milos had another myth in his mind, and this myth was more similar to that of a mortal. He might have seriously thought about what the crystal said in the Cloud Temple and agreed with it. So when Freya made her choice again, it responded, disintegrated itself, and dissipated from this world. It was as if an azure night had pierced through the firmament. This time, mortals killed gods. Milos said that one person must be responsible for the mistakes of this world. That person was her. She had forgiven Kohua. Although Brando still did not understand why the two sides that were once opposing each other would understand each other. He looked at Kohua in the dark. The she-wolf was no longer looking at him, but looking up at the violent energy turbulence in the dark. Brando saw her blinking hard, her eyes were a little red. Incurable. The weak get weaker and the strong get stronger. This is the truth of the world. These guys go against the flow, so they fail again and again. This is the hypocritical order. She said coldly, or why don't you just do what you did back then and fight us fair and square? Let's see who's right and who's wrong. Who's the one who insists on the truth? What kind of man are you if you compromise? That's why you said you have one less enemy. Aren't you happy that you're one step closer to your truth? Brendel glanced at her and replied calmly. The father of the frost giants had chosen to take responsibility for this. He could no longer hold Dark Kohua accountable. As Milos said, although she was wrong, she did not deserve to die. But this guy's attitude and way of speaking were really annoying. He really did not know how she developed her personality. Kohua sighed faintly. My enemies at least used to be good men. It was an honor to fight with them. Now there are only despicable people like you left. I feel unworthy. Yes, and the despicable people are coming to kill you now. Brando could not help but threaten her. You dare. You promised Milos. Dark Kohua's eyes widened. Her beautiful blood-red eyes stared at him with inexplicable surprise. It was exactly the same expression as before. But now they were no longer under the deadly frost forest, nor under the protection of Milos' divine power. They were in the tree hall of New Valhalla. The sun was bright, and through the tall arched windows, the warm but mottled colors blended into the atmosphere of the entire hall. Dust settled up and down under the light. Brando put down the document in his hand, raised his hand and pointed to his forehead, and then pointed to the other's snow-white forehead. You forgot? Dark Kohua's face turned red. She gritted her teeth and looked at Brando. You still have the nerve to say that. Do you know how painful it was when you stabbed me? You don't understand girls at all. And there was so much blood. It was disgusting. Maynard and the kind Kohua were inexplicably surprised. Both of them looked at Brando with a gaze that made his hair stand on end. It was as if they were getting to know the liege all over again. My liege, what did you do to my sister? The kind Corfa's first sentence was fierce, but the second sentence made her lower her head as if she was embarrassed. Her face was red all the way down to her neck. I'm sorry, I mean if you want to do anything to my sister, please ask for my permission first. Although it's a little embarrassing to say this because I'm her twin, I can empathize with her. Brando was almost choked to death by the two sisters who echoed each other. He glared at Dark Kohua. Cut the crap. That thing is indeed in your body now. Unless you want to dig it out and return it to me, you'll have to work for me until then. Dark Kohua's face turned pale. She subconsciously gestured with her hand on her forehead. After losing Milos's divinity, the power of the Moon of Lies was on the kind Kohua. At this moment she was no different from an ordinary human girl. Digging that thing out of her forehead would be suicide. But she hesitated and asked weakly, if I dig that thing out, will you let me go? No. Then die. Dark Kohua gritted her teeth and replied. She replied bitterly, I've lost all my power. I'm no different from a mortal. What's the use of having me here? Dark Kohua seemed to have suddenly thought of something. Her expression changed and she looked at Brando with her beautiful eyes. She opened her small mouth slightly and said in horror, You can't really be greedy. Shut up. Brando interrupted this imaginative fellow in annoyance. What I need is your knowledge. I don't think anyone else in this world can match your knowledge of things in history before the New Age. You mean ancient things? Kohua's expression changed and turned cold. You want to get the secrets of the Twilight Dragon from me? Don't even think about it. Even if you kill me, I will never betray Lord Twilight Dragon. Brando looked at the somewhat determined dark Ko-Hua. He didn't expect her to have such a side to her, but he shook his head. I'm not interested in that. I only care about the present. I have some things here. Please help me identify them. As he spoke, he took out a few items from the dimensional space and placed them on the desk. Ko-Hua's expression changed when she saw the first item. It was a pair of gloves. The gloves were woven with silver threads and inlaid with pearls. On the back of the hand, there was a strange magic formation surrounded by a blood-red gem. The silver threads extended to the 5 fingertips. Then her gaze turned to other things. She couldn't help but bite her lower lip. She looked at Brando with burning anger in her eyes. It was a breastplate. The surface of the breastplate was engraved with the relief of a double-headed eagle. The strange thing was that this armor didn't seem to exist in the modern world. Its state seemed to be constantly changing. It was clearly placed in front of her, but it gave off a feeling that it was far away. Next was a bow. The handle of the bow was the head of a demon. The demon's 4 pairs of long horns extended to both sides, forming the arms of the bow. The bow didn't have a string, but there was a faint purple mark between the arms of the bow. The 4th item was a staff. It looked a little like a spiked hammer because the head of the staff was a cross made of stone. On the cross there was a statue of goddess Gaia. This item was very common in the Earth Holy Temple. It was the scepter that the priests of the Earth Holy Temple often used. However, this one was especially different because there were 4 shining runes on the staff. Brando happened to recognize these runes. They were known as the original runes of the Law of the Earth. These runes didn't seem to be fake, so the origin of this staff was very suspicious. The last item was a cavalry sword. The whole sword structure was very simple. It looked like the work of the elves, but there was a relief of the King of Fire Elves on the pod-shaped hilt of the sword. Out of the 5 pieces of equipment, Brando could only recognize one of them. It was the Dragon's Riddle glove. The glove had almost the same effect as Bahamut's Blessing, but it was a female item. The difference was that Bahamut's Blessing leaned towards defense, while Dragon's Riddle's effect was more towards offense. Apart from being able to complete instant alchemy like Bahamut's Blessing, Dragon's Riddle could also be called a magic circle spell. Magic circle spells were the strongest among all elemental magic, but they were also the most inflexible and cumbersome spells. This was because almost all magic circle spells were ritualistic spells. Not only did the magic circle need to be drawn in advance, some also needed many people to complete the ritual. Dragon's Riddle happened to be called the divine equipment of magic circle mages. Therefore, Bahamut's Blessing was only a piece of fantasy equipment, while Dragon's Riddle was an ancient item. It was only a hair's breadth away from being a demigod item. Ko-Hua looked at these items as if a ball of fire was burning in her chest. She looked like she was about to spit fire. She looked at Brando and said, "These are all mine." "Now they are my spoils of war," Brando replied. "You expect me to tell you how to use them?" Dark Ko-Hua was so angry that she gritted her teeth, as if these words were squeezed out from between her teeth. "Ko-Hua, you're not willing to be immortal, are you?" Brando suddenly asked. "Even if I let you go with your beauty, you'll only be a plaything of the powerful outside. I believe that you're not willing to be like this. You're a person who has the ability to control your own destiny. You'll definitely not be willing to live under someone else's roof. You were once high and mighty and mortals were like ants in your eyes. I believe that once someone has tasted that sweet taste, they won't be willing to be lonely anymore. Am I not living under someone else's roof now?" Dark Ko-Hua replied hatefully, but then her eyes turned slightly and she smiled charmingly. "But I've heard about the history of you humans. In history there were many demon queens who played with power. I believe that with my talent and wisdom, it won't be difficult for me to reach that level. When the time comes, I'll purposely go against you. Let's see how you'll continue this act." Brando was speechless. When he thought about it, it did seem possible. He couldn't help but wonder if this woman was sent by someone to go against him. At least until now, she had already caused him a lot of trouble. However, he immediately realized that this was impossible. Dark Ko-Hua wasn't that kind of person. If she wanted to curry favor with a man, it would be better to just kill her. Seeing through this woman's little trick, he calmed down and shook his head. "Why bother, Miss Ko-Hua? The heart of calamity is in your body. In fact, it's like returning it to its rightful owner. With it, you can still regain great power and create a legend." Heart of calamity? Ko-Hua was slightly startled. She looked at Brando in confusion. "What heart of calamity are you talking about?" "Naturally, it's Ekka's heart of calamity." "You're talking about Ekka's heart of calamity, Count?" The one who spoke wasn't Dark Ko-Hua but her sister, the kind Ko-Hua. She was the girl who had been silently watching her sister bicker with the Count of Tanajul. For the first time, a look of surprise appeared on her face. Brando looked at her with some confusion, wondering why this thing had attracted her attention again. Dark Ko-hwa suddenly exclaimed as if she had realized something. She frowned as if she was sensing something. Seeing her expression, Brando understood that she probably hadn't investigated what the thing in her forehead was. Perhaps it was because she subconsciously thought it was a trap that Brando had set for her. Or perhaps it was because she had lost all hope after losing her power, so she didn't think about it at all. But after a moment she raised her head and stared at Brando with her blood-red eyes. Her expression was extremely complicated. "Mother's key. Mother's key," she muttered to herself. She seemed happy but also a little strange. "You actually gave this to me just to harm me?" The girl couldn't help but look at Brando mockingly. "Mortals are indeed a bunch of idiots. You actually gave this to me. Do you know what this is? Mother's wolf herding in Undermoon, this is the key to the gate to that world. You actually personally handed it to me. Little Brando, you're dead this time?" Brando was slightly startled. Could it be that he had misjudged the potential of Ekka's Heart of Calamity? "Sister, the key only has meaning when it grows up. It's a long process. Don't scare the Count." The kind Ko-hwa hurriedly reminded her out of kindness. "Don't expose me, idiot." Dark Ko-hwa shouted in exasperation. Note, the power comes from Ko-hwa, in the Moon of Lies. The slightly dark Ko-hwa is Ekka's eldest daughter. I saw the book review of Lion Hang 1994. It was very well written and very helpful to me. Thank you very much. Chapter 850. So you're agreeing? Brando didn't care about Dark Ko-hwa's temper. Instead, he saw that her tone had softened. It seemed like the heart of disaster was an unexpected gain for her. Even the frustration and anger from the failure in the deadly frost forest no longer showed on her face. Dark Ko-hwa hesitated for a while before hesitantly saying, "I have a request." "Speak. You have to promise to protect me during this period of time. If anyone wants to harm me and my sister, no matter who the other party is, you have to do your best to ensure our safety. Moreover, when I feel that I have the ability to protect myself, I can choose to leave on my own. You can't stop me. Only then can I consider reluctantly agreeing to your request." Brando looked at Dark Ko-hwa's blood-red eyes and didn't comment. He replied, "The last condition needs to be changed slightly. When you can defeat me, you can choose to leave on your own." Dark Ko-hwa gritted her teeth and couldn't help but reveal the sharp fangs unique to the Dusk Wolf clan. "When I can defeat you, I'll definitely cut you into pieces, you bastard." She thought to herself, but still nodded and reluctantly agreed to Brando's condition. Originally, the last condition was just her being unreasonable and wanted to take the opportunity to blackmail Brando. She didn't expect that he would see through it so quickly, so she didn't want to be thick-skinned and continue to pester him. Brando pushed away the breastplate on the table and asked calmly, "What's the origin of this breastplate?" Dim Korfa's request for protection came as no surprise to him. He could tell that she was still feeling insecure about her current situation. Although he promised Milos not to kill her, it didn't mean that he wouldn't hand her over to someone else. In the civilized world, there were organizations like the Four Holy Cathedrals that pursued the power of order. If the Holy Cathedral of Fire found her and asked him to hand her over, there was no reason for him to harm his own interests for a potential enemy. Brando knew that even though Dark Ko-hwa was stubborn on the surface, she actually cherished her life a lot. Furthermore, she was very greedy for power and authority. To the kind Ko-hwa he could only reason with her, but to the Dark Ko-hwa, it was too easy to catch her tail. Dark Ko-hwa looked at the breastplate unhesitatingly and unwillingly replied, "This breastplate is called Ronia's Crevice. It is a hero's armor tailor-made for the supreme king of the dazzling light, Ronia. It is only a part of it. This set of armor is called the logical sin in our era because it can distort the laws of nature. When normal law threads hit it, the effect will be completely distorted and lose their effect." "Then isn't it invincible?" Brando looked at the breastplate with some surprise. This effect was at least at the level of a divine artifact. "It's not that exaggerated. Don't open your eyes so wide. It will make people think that you're just a country bumpkin," Dark Ko-hwa replied in a disdainful tone. "It's just a distortion. It's still far from being able to completely isolate the laws of nature." Brando didn't wait for Ko-hwa to finish speaking and checked the armor himself. The original attribute of the armor was breastplate, ancient. But after Dark Ko-hwa described it, it became Ronia's Crevice, breastplate. Defense 5. Strength plus 15. Vitality plus 75. Gate of Law. weakens law attacks by 1 level. This was indeed an ancient item. Brando understood when he saw the strange attribute ratio. And this breastplate was not invincible in Ko Hua's words? He couldn't help but gulp. Weakening law attacks by 1 level meant that the lines of law had no effect on the existence of Elemental Awakened and him. The lines of law attacks of Elemental Awakened opponents were as weak as the peak of gold. The only drawback of this breastplate was that its ability was basically useless against opponents below Elemental Awakened. However, this only drawback was basically insignificant compared to its advantages. This was because he had improved the toughest defense against the lines of law after Elemental Awakening, and this was only one of the accessories of this set of armor. Brando couldn't imagine what the attributes of the full set of Ronia's crevice were. The dazzling light are of the dusk species? No, Ko Hua shook his head, they are gold folk. Gold folk? Brando suddenly realized that this armor might have once been Ko Hua's spoils of war. Sure enough, she replied proudly, I did pluck this from Ronia's corpse. It's of no value. I just kept it as a souvenir, so I only kept the breastplate with his emblem. What a wastrel. Brando finally understood how terrifying Ko Hua was in ancient times. No wonder she didn't care about mortals at all. Now that she had fallen to this state, it was difficult for her. Then what about this? Brando moved his hand away from the breastplate and placed it on the demonic longbow. The classification of ancient items was very vague. The Ronia's crevice had the strength of a mythical item. In fact, in a sense, it was close to a subdivine artifact, but it did not have the ability to instantly change the situation of a battle like a subdivine artifact. Moreover, most subdivine artifacts had extraordinary origins and were not comparable to mythical items. Bow of Retribution. What's the use of it? It has another name. It's called the Bow of Retribution. It means a life in exchange for a life. This bow was made from the head of a Balrog lord in the lower layer of the Sulphur River. In my opinion, it's just a very interesting toy. Brando frowned. Ko Hua's description gave him a bad feeling. He searched for the attributes of the bow. After Ko Hua's simple description, the attributes of the bow became visible. Bow of Retribution. Attack power 75 to 105. Retribution. At the cost of 1 soul, draw the bow once. There were no attribute bonuses, and the attack power was ridiculously high, almost as high as the Holy Lance of Heaven. When he looked at the attached skills, he knew that this was a demonic item through and through. Brando had always kept a respectful distance from demonic items, but he still asked, this bow requires the wielder to consume his life to draw the bow? Of course not. Otherwise, who would use such a stupid thing? This bow consumes its user's life, and it can easily kill an elemental awakened being in your language, no different from squashing an ant. Corfa replied. Brendel was taken aback. This bow is so powerful. Although sacrificing a life in exchange for a chance to draw the bow sounded evil, if there was more than one enemy in a battle, he could kill the weaker opponents first in exchange for a chance to draw the bow to deal with the elemental awakened existences. After all, elemental awakened existences were highly respected figures in any region, so this bow was a little too outrageous. However, Dark Ko Hua seemed to guess what he was thinking when he saw his expression. Stop dreaming, country bumpkin. How can an ordinary soul drive it? The soul that drives this bow must at least have the seed of the law. Seed of the law. According to you, it must at least be elemental awakened. F***ck Brando immediately lost interest in the bow. A demonic item was indeed a demonic item, full of the taste of chicken ribs. Then what about this thing? He took out the heavy stone scepter and asked. Unexpectedly, Dark Ko Hua glanced at it and his eyes flickered slightly. This thing has some history. I'll tell you about it later. Let me tell you about the history of the last cavalry sword. Brando was slightly startled, but he nodded calmly. She looked at the cavalry sword with a pod-shaped guard. It was a one-handed sword, a bit like a command sword. The whole sword was quite exquisite, a bit like a ceremonial item. This is the work of the fire elves. They forged this sword from a large furnace. I like its shape very much. It's also my trophy. Dark Ko Hua still answered with some hatred. It's called the Realm of Fire. Brendel's heart skipped a beat when he heard the name. He suddenly remembered that his senior sister had a similar weapon in his previous life. It was called the World of Wind, and that staff was also an ancient artifact. Only now did he remember that the staff was very similar to this cavalry sword, and there was a statue of the King of Wind Elves at the top of the staff. He subconsciously glanced at Maynard and found that the female knight was also looking at the sword a little strangely. Obviously, it had also evoked her memories. Could it be that this sword and the staff are a set? Brando picked up the sword. Realm of Fire, attack 55 to 87, bloodline power plus 100. Bloodline of Fire. When the Realm of Fire is in flames, the attributes increased by the user will be converted into strength. At the same time, when the wielder comes into contact with flames, the wielder will not be harmed. Instead, the damage will be converted into healing effects. When the wielder casts a fire-related spell, casting speed plus 3. What an extreme attribute. Brando first sighed. Such extreme attributes of an ancient item were really rare in modern magic items. This sword was a typical magic sword. A magic swordsman would be like a fish in water with it. However, Brando still had the same thought. It was a pity that he did not walk the path of a magic swordsman. He looked at Maynard, then put down the sword and looked up, waiting for Dark Kohua's final explanation. There was no doubt that among the 5 pieces of equipment, the most valuable was the stone scepter. Sure enough, Kohua looked at the scepter and sighed. Actually, you should have heard of this scepter before. It is the will of the mountains. The will of the mountains? The one who spoke was Maynard. The female knight frowned and asked, "Is it a sacred item of the goddess Gaia?" "Is that thing?" After Maynard's reminder, Brando also remembered. Today, on the southwest border of the Cruz Empire, on the Great Plains bordering Erewhon, the area known as the grassland of Benin was still the traditional sphere of influence of the Temple of Earth. In the north was a steep snow-covered mountain range. The kingdom of the mountain dwarves separated the southern border of the empire from the grassland of Benin. It was where the kingdom of the Lion Men of Toquinen was located. In history, the Golden Mane Lion Men had once escaped from the Sacred Covenant, which was a disgrace to them. After the victory of the War of the Holy Saints, Toquinen and the Temple of Earth were excluded, which aroused the hatred between the humans and the Lion Men. To this day, the Lion Men of Toquinen were still invading the borders of the humans, as if they were just trying to regain their lost glory. In an earlier era, the power of the Temple of Earth was not as weak as it was today. Before the fall of Babel Fortress, it was said that in the mountains north of the grassland of Benin, there was a temple that belonged to the goddess of Earth. There were 3 divine artifacts in the temple. One was the Haoran Gaia, the other was the Holy Lance of Heaven, and the last one was the Will of the Mountains. Among the 3 divine artifacts, the Haoran Gaia was a sacred sword given to the hero of the giants, Miguel. Later, when Miguel was defeated and died, this sword was lost in the mortal world. The Haoran Gaia in Brando's hand was this item, but this sacred sword had suffered irreversible damage along with its owner in the war with the Twilight. Until now, it only had the power of a fantasy weapon. It could be said that its symbolic significance to the Temple of Earth was far greater than its actual use. The origin of the Holy Lance of Heaven was needless to say. It was a sacred object given to the heroes of the mortal world by Gaia. As for the last mountain, it was a sacred object of the goddess of Earth herself. In the legends of the origin, only her priests could pick it up, and the person who picked it up would naturally become the next master of the Temple of Earth, the divine chosen of the goddess of Earth Gaia. And Brando happened to have such a person under his command. Himalud's shepherdess, Hippamera. Priest Himalud believed in the eldest daughter of the goddess of Earth Gaia, the goddess of Tundra Himalud. In fact, she was also a follower of Gaia. The key was that the priests of the Temple of Earth in this era actually believed in the giant Miguel. Miguel was the creator of the dwarves and belonged to the dwarven gods. The real priests of Gaia had disappeared long before the War of the Holy Saints, and Himalud's priests were the ones closest to this pantheon. Brando suppressed the excitement in his heart and carefully picked up the scepter. The scepter was heavy and cold to the touch. Among the 3 sacred objects of Gaia, the Haoran Gaia, the Azure Lance of Heaven and the Mountain of Rivers were all true divine artifacts. Except for the Haoran Gaia, which was damaged, the other 2 were well preserved, so the scepter in his hand should also be a genuine divine artifact. He raised the scepter and an attribute menu with dark golden pages appeared in his field of vision. Mountains will divine equipment, attack 1 to 215, strength plus 1 to 400. The winner of Earth and Mountains. The one who picks up the scepter will gain a warrior's level and battle experience equal to the priest's level. The priest can integrate the blessings of the earth into his or her battle style. The more blessings he or she receives, the higher the attack power and attributes of the scepter. Special. Only priests of Gaia's will can use this scepter. Brando looked at the attributes and could not help but be slightly startled. What the hell were these attributes? Attack power 1 to 215? The upper limit of the attack was almost twice that of the Azure Lance. One must know that the Azure Lance was already known as one of the most offensive weapons among the divine artifacts, and looking at this lower limit of attack again, he was a little dumbfounded. Could it be that this legendary scepter was actually a weapon that depended on one's looks? Looking at the attribute bonus again, he could not help but be even more confused. The attack bonus could be fluctuated, but how could the attribute bonus fluctuate? He subconsciously looked at the additional skills at the back and suddenly realized what was going on. However, he still did not quite understand what this so-called Earth's blessing was. The attributes of the entire weapon were unclear, and perhaps he would have to wait for Hippamera to come and try it out to understand what was going on. He hesitated for a moment before putting down the divine artifact in his hand, because at this time, a small ball of light flew in from the skylight at the top of the hall and came in front of Brando, and then put down a letter. Brando looked at the letter and was immediately stunned. The emblem of a gray wolf was drawn on the letter. This was not because he was confused but because he was surprised. He did not expect that the opportunity would come at this moment, and the many days of waiting suddenly seemed to have paid off. Kargleis has finally arrived. He let out a long sigh and looked up at the kind Corfa. The latter had obviously read what she wanted from his heart. She smiled gently and said, "I've always heard that the Count is preparing for a war. It seems that the time has come. Unfortunately, Corfa is really not interested in these things, so I'll have to take my leave first." Brando was a little embarrassed. Sometimes, divine power was an incredible thing in the eyes of mortals. Although he knew that Ko Hua would not use it to do anything bad, he still felt very uncomfortable. He could not help but explain. "This is not for war but for peace." Brando answered. Perhaps he did not want to leave a bad impression on her. Unexpectedly, the girl shook her head and said, "I understand, my lord. Not all battles are meaningless. For selfish desires, for justice, war has all kinds of goals, and some even have the attributes of evil and justice. I'm not against war, I just don't like fighting. My lord, you don't have to worry too much." After saying this, she bowed slightly to Brando and left. She did not behave like a demigod, but more like a well-behaved noble lady. Ko Hua in the dark did not seem to hear the conversation between her sister and Brando. She stood there motionlessly until her sister left. She shook her head and said, "How naive." Brando did not expect this girl to be so merciless to her twin sister. He could not help but look at her. But what he did not expect was that Senior Maynard seemed to agree with her sister. But then he understood that the kind Ko Hua was indeed too naive when she said that she wanted to stay away from war. Hating war wasn't a bad thing, but sometimes disputes couldn't be avoided just because you wanted to. Blindly avoiding war was actually just enjoying the protection provided by others. But one day, everyone who was willing to fight for you would leave you, and you would not be able to avoid it. When Arek forced her to intervene in the conflict, it was the dark Ko Hua who stood up for her sister. But what if the dark Ko Hua was no longer there? Brendel shook his head and said to the little ball of light, "Can I trouble you to call Monica over for me?" The light spirit nodded happily at him in the air and flew out of the hall in the blink of an eye. Brando opened the letter. It was indeed a familiar name. "I dare not forget your kindness. I await your arrival. Corwin." He looked up, and his gaze seemed to have passed through the stained glass arch of the hall. Under the blue sky, on the other side of the clouds, there were the mountains of Yusong. The curtains of the autumn war finally opened. Chapter 851. As early as the month of harvest, the villages and manors from the north of Buchi to the Grimoire's Passage were notified that the Roman Black Rose of Buchi might be stirring. The white-winged cavalry of the Vermeer Legion under Braggs was stationed there. The deputy commander, Walter, had already received the news from the princess, warning the local areas of the possible war and organizing the evacuation. However, this work was carried out in name only. The people of the land, especially the farmers, were reluctant to part with their most precious wealth. The nobles were also unwilling to send their hired farmers to the north and let the land go to waste. The key was that the last period before the autumn harvest, the fields were still heavy with wheat ears. If they fled at this time, the year's harvest would be hopeless, and it might even be affected in the coming year. Almost everyone stayed with a fluke mentality except for a few craftsmen. However, in the north of Buchi, these orders were carried out very well. The memories of the war from last year were still fresh in the minds of the residents, and a deep fear was still in their bones. However, most of the refugees from that time were originally gathered near Brugloss, and the fear brought about by the war brought more refugees. These people almost overwhelmed this city at the southern border. In order to ensure the supply of the army, the city lord, Baron Rockwell, had to reduce the rations of the refugees outside the city. A feeling of anger and uneasiness had spread among the people. In early September, a letter was handed to Princess Griffin by Freya. Your Royal Highness, Madara may have completed the unification today. The composition of the army has greatly changed compared to the War of the Black Rose. In the west of the Sea of the Dead Moon, a large number of necromancers have pledged allegiance to the Immortal Supreme. Therefore, there may be a large number of necromancers in Madara's army. Please be careful. When Griffin saw the letter, she was studying the history of the continent of Vaunt with Lady Wei Shaisai. When she saw the letter, she was shocked. She looked up and smiled apologetically at her teacher. Lady Wei Shaisai had always served the royal family and was the kind of noble woman who was very well informed. She was very astute and realized what had happened. She smiled and nodded at her Royal Highness, put away her teaching materials and left. Griffin hurriedly picked up the letter and went to find Oberwei. After reading the letter, Oberwei was a little puzzled. It was not easy to plant an informant in Madara. The royal faction spent a lot of effort in the past year to plant a few very peripheral informants, but the news they sent back was that everything was normal. How did Count Tonagel know so clearly? He flicked the corner of the letter and pondered for a moment. Your Royal Highness, can you confirm the origin of this letter? This letter was personally handed to me by Freya. There shouldn't be any problems. Griffin blushed. She was embarrassed to say that only she and Brando knew about the secret mark on the letter because she did not tell anyone about it. She was also worried that Oberwei would think that she did not trust him enough. However, Oberwei's expression did not change. He shook his head and said, "This is a little too strange. Where did Count Tonagel get this information from?" "But Oberwei, I don't think Count Tonagel has any reason to lie to us about this matter." Griffin frowned and argued. Oberwei looked at his nominal student with some surprise. He had heard rumors that she had a grudge with Count Tonagel, but he did not expect them to reconcile so quickly. However, this was also good. Before Brando became famous, Oberwei had interacted with him for a long time. He always felt that this person was not as greedy as the rumors said. Although time would change everything, some deep-rooted nature was difficult to remove. Besides, Erwin needed stability now. If the princess was eager to fight for power and wealth, it would not be a good thing. Fortunately, the princess knew the big picture. Oberwei nodded, but immediately shook his head and said, "The letter said that Madara may have completed the unification today. If this is true, this letter is too important. However, I have some doubts about whether Madara can complete such a major change in just a year and a half." Although Erwin had just experienced a war, it was the same for Madara. Madara is a huge country with more interests and entanglements. It will take a longer time to digest the benefits of the war. Count Tonagel once asserted that the war was a border dispute instigated by the Blood Staff, and I agree. This kind of thing has happened many times in Erwin's history, and it is not only in Madara. Occasionally, the lords on the border of Erwin would privately lead troops into Madara to plunder. He smiled bitterly and did not tell Griffin that in the early years, such situations were more common. The Blood Staff invaded Karsuk to retaliate against the Lord of the Golden City. At that time, Madara was in a state of disunity, and Erwin was a kingdom with complete sovereignty. In history, there had never been a tradition of the weak side repeatedly invading the strong side. But since the War of the Black Rose, this situation gradually began to reverse. In fact, most of the knowledgeable people in the kingdom could clearly see that the black cloth Roman rose might be budding. But if it was said that Madara quickly completed the unification and was about to start another all-out war, no one would believe it. But if Brando was here, he would tell him that the nature of this war was very special. To put it bluntly, it was the Supreme One of Madara and the Queen of Banshees, Yalvit, acting together to deceive the Blood Staff to die. On the surface, Madara was still divided, but as he said, in essence, it had completed the unification. This war was the Supreme One's last battle to eliminate the dissidents. Now, in Madara's territory, all the resources and forces were united, preparing for the next battle to revive the Dark Kingdom. And now, under the connivance of the Supreme One, the Bloodstaff's army was the first to complete the transformation. This would be the first new Madara army that the Kingdom of Erwin encountered. In history, Duke Grimoires had suffered a great loss. Unfortunately, Brando was not here and could not explain all this. He could only hope that Princess Griffin and Oberwei would pay enough attention to his opinion. After listening to Oberwei's words, Griffin still could not make up her mind. This time she was facing an almost unknown opponent. Before the War of the Black Rose, Madara was a scourge on the borders, and the local nobles were pressing on step by step. In fact, this still represented the thoughts of most of the nobles. If it was not to solve the problem of Randner, this autumn war would still be just another border dispute for Erwin. Although Griffin faintly recognized that the rise of Madara could be a threat to this ancient kingdom, it was impossible to understand the other party in such an environment. She thought for a moment before replying, although this judgment is logical, it is too arbitrary. I believe that the Count will not speak without thinking. I'm not doubting the Count. Oberwei could not help but smile bitterly again. It seemed that his student trusted Count Tonagel more than usual. He suddenly realized that the battle in Ampere Seal might have left a deep impression on the princess, causing her to somewhat blindly trust Brando's military ability. In fact, he and Count Audi knew that Brando's military ability was only average, but his judgment of the development of the situation was extraordinary. He thought for a moment. Perhaps he had described Brando's battle experience too romantically when talking to her. He originally wanted to leave a deep impression on the princess out of admiration. After all, Tonagel was indeed a rare talent, and he was more loyal to the kingdom and ideals. Compared to people like Makarov and Fleetwood, he admired the younger generation more. But at this moment, Oberwei shook his head. It seemed that it was necessary to remind the princess to prevent her from having unrealistic thoughts. This was not a good thing for Brando and for her. He pondered for a moment before adding, I'm just worried that Count Tonagel has been misled by the information. You're saying that Count Tonagel's information might be false, or even a trap? Griffin reacted and asked with a frown. Oberwei nodded. Half an hour later, Duke Audine, Duke Vero, and the Highland Knights delegation were summoned. Duke Vero read the letter in his hand and pondered for a moment before calling for his men. The middle-aged knight, who claimed to have dealt with Madara for a long time and had some understanding of the Romans' Black Rose, shook his head after hearing the princess's question. Recently there have been rumors that Madara is undergoing some changes, but I think it's precisely this time that they will be more cautious in their actions. If what Count Tonagel said is true, but at this time, how can the Blood Staff receive full support from their Supreme? I think our main enemy should be Count Radner. Duke Vero expressed his own opinion. We have just signed a peace treaty with Madara, and the Blood Staff should not be too reckless. He should have been bewitched by Count Radner, and thought that he saw an opportunity to send troops to take advantage of the situation to curry favor with their Supreme. Duke Vero's answer was too subjective, and everyone present could not help but shake their heads. Griffin even frowned because her grandfather's analysis was almost the complete opposite of Brando's. It could be seen that the focus of Count Tonagel's plan was on Madara. This was also in line with her thoughts. She did not want to make any changes, so she pretended not to hear her grandfather's answer and looked at the Highland Knight. The leader of the Highland Knights diplomatic group was an experienced and steady old knight, but the one who spoke was a slightly younger wizard. The wizard simply replied, according to the information we received, we do not support Count Tonagel's view. Although the Supreme of Madara has almost unified the opinions of the Dark Nobles, Madara is not completely unified yet. Most of the vampire families support him, but the Dark Lords are divided at heart. The Liches are only temporarily bowing their heads under the pressure of the first two. In addition, the Queen of the Banshees, Yalvit, has always been resisting the recruitment of the Holy Palace of Illodaner. In our opinion, there will be a battle between the two sooner or later. It seemed that almost all the information was against Brando's judgment. Griffin was a little embarrassed. From the bottom of her heart, she was willing to believe in Count Tonagel. Although she was a little afraid of Brando's ambitions, she trusted Brando's judgment of the future situation, especially when the two of them had surprisingly similar views on politics. But how can I convince the others? Or did I really make a mistake? At this time, Freya finally could not help but speak. Maybe Yalvit and the Queen are just a couple in appearance? The Blood Staff has started a war, which is tantamount to violating the peace agreement between the two countries. If they win, it will be fine, but if they lose, it is likely that they will be eliminated directly. The Blood Staff itself is the most unruly of the Dark Lords. It has no reason to curry favor with the Supreme One of Madara. Choga is a cruel and greedy lord. When he took revenge on Karsuk, it was only out of his irritable nature and not driven by reason. He may also be despising the authority of the Supreme One again. If this is the case, the information on the stage will make sense. Her words silenced the entire study. No one knew that this was the closest guess to the truth. Even Freya herself did not understand. She just heard Brando mention it by chance and blindly trusted his judgment. But after a moment of silence, she saw the Highland Knights shaking their heads. The middle-aged knight under Duke Vero even said, "Ridiculous, this is purely a conspiracy theory. This is a war. How can we speculate about the relationship between the Supreme One and the Blood Staff? The key is what you said, Other than speculation, do you have any evidence? Evidence? Freya's face turned red. The evidence was that this was what Brando told her, but she also understood that this sentence obviously could not be used as evidence. In the end, it was Griffith who helped her out. In any case, the Count's proposal is for the purpose of caution. Pass the contents of this letter to the generals below. It is not a bad thing to be prepared. After that, Her Royal Highness glanced at the daughter of the Earth Knight and could not help but shake her head. She knew that Brando hoped that this little girl could be independent in the future. She did have the qualifications and background, and after experiencing so many things, she had indeed become calm. But when it came to the debate with Count Tonagel, she still seemed a little too anxious. For some reason she was faintly envious. Brando's political ideas were actually her political ideas, and one of the ideas in her mind was to guard against Madara. But she could not stand up and defend her and Count Tonagel's opinions bluntly like Freya. Because she was the sister of the future King Erwin, the actual holder of the balance of the kingdom at the moment. Oberway looked at the handwritten letter written by his nominal student. It was the opinions that everyone had passed on Brando's proposal. He secretly shook his head. Her Royal Highness was still a little too inexperienced in these aspects. She did not understand the people below her. Vero and the Lantan Island messengers seemed to be very indifferent, and the attitude of the Highland Knight did not show enough importance. If the higher-ups were like this, then the subordinates were even more disobedient. It was very doubtful how much enforcement of this order would be left. But the Wolf Knight did not expect that they would soon not have to worry about this problem, because before this order had even walked out of the gates of Valendon Castle, the black rose of Bucci had quietly bloomed in the shadows. Golan Elson Corridor. This corridor was located in the northern part of the Yuzan Mountains, between the Tosankard Forest and Bucci. It had another name, the Silman region. Like most of the territories located at the border of Erwin, Silman was not a rich land. The west of Silman was full of hills, and only the east of Silman had flat areas. Scattered villages and manors were scattered on this valley belt. There were two rivers in the south. One flowed through Bucci, and the other flowed through the Silman River Valley, and finally merged into Lake Valendon. The second river was the lifeline of the Silman region. Since the month of harvest, 3 regiments of cavalry had been scattered along this lifeline. It sounded powerful, but they were loosely distributed to every town. In fact, it was only the strength of 1 or 2 squadrons. In order to prevent the forces from being scattered, the deputy commander Walter concentrated most of the effective forces in the most prosperous owl town in the Silman region. Then he released the patrols and scouts of the entire cavalry division in squads to monitor the Yuzan mountain pass in the south. And it was in the evening that the patrols that were supposed to return on time disappeared one after another. It was around 7 o'clock in the morning when a scout reported that there were traces of undead activity in the south. However, most of the people in the Silman Valley were still holding on to their wishful thinking, and even Walter thought that this was just Madara's probing. The reason was simple. Since Madara controlled the wider Bucci region, they did not see any need to attack from the Silman River Valley. At 8:30, Walter saw a messenger from Vermeer, and learned that a large number of undead troops had been attacking Vermeer's first line of defense since the afternoon. Madara's main offensive force was indeed in Bucci. Walter was relieved. Although he also received a warning from the princess, Vermeer's army was actually closer to the Duke of Grenoir's. This was a fact that everyone knew. The princess reminded the Duke out of kindness, but the Duke, especially his subordinates, might not appreciate it. Moreover, these people who had been fighting with Madara all year round thought that the higher-ups were just randomly giving orders. They knew too well what the skeletons on the other side of the mountain were thinking. At 10 o'clock at night, Walter rubbed his eyes and walked out of the tent. He tried to take one last look, and then he saw the miracle of stars rising in the sky. Chapter 852. If you have a monthly vote, please vote for Blackie's new book, Calamity Descends. He's not far from the top 6. Thank you for your help. The pages of the paper fluttered in the dark night, and the cold autumn wind blew through the empty streets. The notice about the attack by unknown bandits in the Tosankard mining area 3 months ago seemed to be pulled by an invisible hand. It flapped its wings like a butterfly on the bulletin board, along with a few other wanted posters. The militia and the guards were running around the streets like headless flies. Chaotic shouts and sharp whistles resounded throughout the town in the night. The bell on the steeple of the Holy Cathedral in the center of the town finally rang. The nightmares of the night were like an omen of uneasiness, shrouding everyone's heads in an instant. However, in the midst of the panic, there were still people who treated it coldly. Chanali was wearing the uniform of the White Wing Cavalry Regiment. He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall outside the city hall, coldly looking at a young couple who were parting not far away. "Ronnie, take this with you. I heard that places like Svenfano are very cold. You'll need it." A young man wearing the uniform of the guards stuffed a thick fur coat into the hands of the girl in the carriage with a concerned look. Most of the people in the carriage were gloomy and silent. Only the girl's face was pale. She grabbed the young man's hand tightly and asked, "Evan, aren't you coming with us?" The young man smiled and said, "Ronnie, I'm a member of the guards. I'm under the command of Her Highness the Princess. I swear to be loyal to this kingdom and the future king. It's my responsibility to protect this land and everyone. Don't be stubborn. I'll meet up with you soon." He unsheathed his sword, and the gleaming blade sent a chill down everyone's spine. "My swordsmanship is one of the best in the guards. Those skeletons are nothing to be afraid of. Ronnie, just you wait. I'll make a name for myself just like the Breton Knight and Count Tonagel." The girl pursed her lips as she looked at him. Another hurried whistle sounded from the other end of the street, and the boy turned back to take a look. He quickly turned back and patted the girl's hand. "The instructor is rushing us. Wait for me at Svenfano. Don't worry, it's just a few scattered Madara troops. Their main force is still at Buchi on the other side of the mountain. The White-Winged Cavalry has already told us that this battle is not a big deal." The girl then nodded with tears in her eyes. Shinali watched for a while and felt a little bored. He glanced at his companion who was leading her horse and his horse out of the courtyard of the city hall. He immediately asked, "Captain, did you persuade them? Those short-sighted bastards." The female knight curled her lips and replied coldly. Shinali knew that she had persuaded them, but the process of persuasion was not pleasant. They were a bunch of short-sighted bastards who only cared about the benefits in front of them. He agreed with this point, but they were the same. No one had ever said that the men of the Vermeer Legion were righteous. On the contrary, they had a bad reputation. He grabbed the saddle and mounted the horse. At the same time, he swept his hand behind him so that his cloak and the sword hanging at his waist would not fall to the side of the horse's back. He turned his head and saw Rosa doing the same. Both of them were veteran riders who had experienced the tragic battle a year ago. Shinali still remembered the scene when he charged into the endless sea of skeletons. In the dark night, as far as the eye could see, there was only a sea of flickering phosphorescence. Such a magnificent scene sent chills down his spine. It was said that in that battle, many people were stabbed to death by spears because they slowed down in fear. But after familiarizing themselves with the battle with Madara, people gradually realized that the strength of the skeletons was not much. The strength of the skeletons was far inferior to that of an adult. However, the army that did not know fear, fatigue, and retreat left a deep impression on him. Shinali touched the scar on his cheek and asked, "Where are we going?" "To rendezvous with our troops." Rosa grabbed the reins, clamped the horse's belly slightly, and took the lead in trotting out. Shinali had no choice but to follow. But suddenly, a sharp whistle swept over their heads, shaking the roof tiles on both sides of the street and causing them to fall down. He raised his head subconsciously. Ivan grabbed his sword and was running towards the rendezvous point. The sudden whistle made the youth stop in his tracks. He looked up in shock. In the vast night sky to the south of the town, countless specks of light were slowly rising. These specks of light rose into the air, gathered into a ball, and then suddenly scattered like a flock of birds. At that moment, the youth finally understood what it was. Hide! A shrill scream came from somewhere. The sky was filled with arrows that fell like raindrops. There were still some pedestrians on the street who were fleeing north, but now they fell like wooden stakes under the rain of arrows. The cold arrows that had been tempered by magic pierced through the fragile human bodies. The soul fire on the arrows burned fiercely as if it was on fire. In the blink of an eye, the victims were turned into human figures struggling in the flames. Only a small number of people with fast reflexes managed to survive, and Ivan was one of them. The long-term training of the guards ultimately saved his life. He didn't even know how he reacted, and when he came back to his senses, his body was already lying in front of a pottery workshop. He looked up numbly and saw that the signboard hanging in front of the workshop had been pierced by several arrows. It was slowly being engulfed by the blue flames. What happened? He turned around and saw a patch of weeds suddenly growing on the flagstone streets. It was the tail feathers of arrows, corpses, residents who were scared to the point of collapse, and burning wreckage. It was as if the entire town had turned into a scene from hell in an instant. Evan looked at all of this with his mouth agape. At this moment, a second shriek swept across the sky above the town, causing the ground to tremble slightly. In his vision, a winged creature that he had never seen before flapped its wings and flew up to the steeple of the Holy Temple in the center of the town. The Knight Captain Gage of the White-Winged Cavalry's 7th Squadron froze there. He wanted to grab his commander's sword several times, but he could not grab it. Less than 100 meters in front of him, countless skeletal arms were lifting up the soil and reaching out from the ground. Then came skulls with phosphorescent eye sockets, then collarbones, shoulder armor, and the entire upper body. Countless skeletons were climbing out from the ground one after another. They shook off the dirt on their black nether steel chainmail. With longbows in hand, they stood up one by one and walked forward to a predetermined position. They then raised their longbows. The arrows on the longbows were burning with a faint flame. It was as if in an instant, a complete formation of longbow archers had appeared in front of him. Almost all the knight beside Gage were at a loss. Because when they looked around, this scene was not just happening in front of them. It was happening everywhere in the front of the Silman Valley. Under the night sky, the phosphorescent light on the arrows of the skeleton archers formed a continuous belt of light. This belt of light stretched from west to east. There was no end in sight. But the crux of the problem was, where did they come from? Where were the scouts? Where did they die? How did these damn skeletons get around the defensive line? Could it be that it came from underground? Everyone's heart was filled with these questions. But to Gage, these questions had converged into one main problem. What to do? When the second wave of arrows rained down from the sky, the White-Winged Cavalry's Vice Captain Walter finally reacted. He finally realized that this was not some harassment. Even during the War of the Black Rose, he had never seen so many skeleton archers. The Dark Lords of Madara liked to divide their army into small squads, each squad commanded by their own. Normally, a squad of liches would command 10 to 12 skeletons. It depended on the number of liches and Black Knight under the Dark Lord's command. This kind of battle style was like a knight leading his squires into battle. Only in large-scale battles would one see hundreds and thousands of liches commanding tens of thousands of skeletons to charge forward like a tsunami. That was the scene that the human army was most afraid of. But fortunately, this kind of opportunity was rare even for the Roman Black Rose. First of all, gathering thousands of liches was a difficult matter. It required the cooperation of many Dark Lords to accomplish it. But this was precisely the hardest thing to happen in Madara. So when Walter saw thousands of skeleton archers on the long line of battle, his first reaction was that he had been fooled. There were at least 3 to 4 Dark Lords fighting side by side, and they were working together seamlessly. At this time, even if he was stupid, he would have realized that Sealman's path, which looked more difficult to attack, was precisely Madara's main direction of attack. After realizing this, he immediately thought, what should I do now? How should I resolve this battle? Can I still resolve it? The only thing he was thankful for was that he was commanding the cavalry. Compared to Madara's regular skeleton warriors, the cavalry at least had the advantage of mobility and impact. Although Madara had Black Knight as well, they were too few in number. They could not play a decisive role in this battle. The deputy commander quickly calmed down. Madara's attack was too sudden. These damned skeletons suddenly appeared from the ground and appeared in front of them almost instantly. There was no time to react at all, and a brigade of his cavalry was finished. Although the cavalry was not completely annihilated in the beginning, but they were scattered around the battlefield. There was almost no organization between them and they were not connected at all. Soon they would lose the will to fight. Walter was very familiar with his own men, so he did not expect any miracle to happen. But he still had 2 brigades. That was enough. Dispatch. He finally made up his mind and shouted. One order after another was relayed amidst the chaos. When the remaining 2 cavalry clans in the Silverman Valley gathered to launch an assault on the skeletal archers' left flank, just as Walter had predicted, the first clan of the White-Winged Cavalry had fallen into utter chaos. The 1st Brigade's Knight commander, the gold-ranked Great Knight Garen, was shot in the eye socket by the first wave of arrows and died on the spot. Then, the skeleton army suddenly crawled out from the ground and directly dragged the 1st Brigade into the chaos. The battle had only lasted for half an hour, and the 4th Squadron was completely annihilated. The 7th Squadron's Knight Captain Gage was killed, and the 8th Squadron's Knight Captain Opum was seriously injured and unconscious. The remaining Supreme Commander fell to the head of the 8th Squadron's Vice Captain, Portland. This person did not have much of a mind of his own, so he simply led his troops to retreat to Owl Town. Thus, Madara's army was completely unobstructed. The remaining 2 cavalry brigades were instantly exposed to the enemy's attacks. When Walter saw this scene from the high ground, he was so angry that he wanted to curse. In his heart, he had already dragged Opim out and beheaded him many times. Unfortunately, his anger was useless now. It was too late to withdraw the order now. He could only hope that Madara's reaction was not that fast, and they could not change the direction of the battlefield in such a short time. Or perhaps, his men were better and could withstand 1 or 2 waves of attacks. As long as they could kill their way into the skeleton archers' camp, then the rest would be easy. They were cavalry and the enemy was just infantry. If this was the War of the Black Rose, perhaps the white-winged cavalry would have already collapsed. Fortunately, it had been a year since the war, and this year was enough for everyone who had experienced that terrible war to lick their wounds. Those terrible undead were now just ugly skeletons in the hearts of the veterans, and they were no longer synonymous with death. Other than being dull and fearless, they were even worse than ordinary human soldiers. Without the fear that originated from the root, the Roman Tuo's Black Rose was just a slightly special opponent. Walter thought of this and pursed his lips. Bless Martha. Time has not only changed Madara, he thought silently in his heart. And it was indeed so. Balls of illumination magic exploded on the battlefield, illuminating the hundreds and thousands of cavalrymen and the last distance between them and the skeleton army of Madara. Among the slowly advancing cavalrymen, mages flew up from behind the knight one after another, leaving the back of their horses and floating in the air. Although their spells would expose the white-winged cavalry to the range of the skeleton archers, the cavalrymen were preparing for the final sprint. It was almost impossible to carry out such a tactic in the dark. Although legend said that some cavalrymen might be able to do it, the commanders of the white-winged cavalry knew that their men were capable of it. The Knight Captain Vance of the 2nd Cavalry Brigade felt that the good lads on horseback were overtaking him one after another. In fact, the entire 2nd Cavalry Brigade was in a state of acceleration. About 100 meters away was the 1st Cavalry Brigade. The cavalrymen under Valerie's command were a little ahead of them. Their task was to open a path in the sea of skeletons so that they could slaughter the necromancers behind them. Vance suddenly felt his body become lighter. This was a sign that a wind spell had taken effect on him and his horse. Thanks to all kinds of strange magic, the cavalrymen were able to charge in such a rugged terrain at night. These tactics were summed up in the War of the Black Rose. Before that, the kingdom's army had been following the experience gained from the First Holy War. They were conservative and old-fashioned and in fact were not suitable for war. War was fair to both sides. The Madara in front of them might be stronger than before, but they were not the same. Just wait and see, damn skeletons. He waved his long sword excitedly. Cavalry tactics were the greatest invention in the history of civilization. When you personally participated in it, you would be surrounded by horses and armored knights with swords in their hands. When all of these formed an irresistible torrent of steel forward, every participant felt as if they were personally controlling this extraordinary power. It was an addictive feeling. For Vance it made no difference. The rain of arrows began, clanking as they fell on the armor, but it did not cause any damage. The horses of the cavalrymen were not close relatives of the draft horses, and the tamed monsters were closer to the unicorns in terms of bloodline. Although they were not as powerful as their relatives in the forest, they were still far stronger than ordinary beasts. Therefore, after the impact of the arrows was reduced by the thick armor, the impact of the arrows was transmitted to them was negligible. The knight at the front had begun to let out strange cries. At this distance, it was time to prepare for the lich's spells. However, the mages at the back were also ready to attack. This was the last hurdle. Once they broke through, the skeleton army would be in front of them. In the War of the Black Rose, not many armies dared to face the sea of skeletons head-on. But now it was different. The mysterious cloak that was draped over the army had long faded due to the accumulation of time after the war. Especially for the veterans who had participated in the First War, the skeletons in front of them were just skeletons. New and old grudges were in front of them. They held their breath and wanted to teach the enemy a lesson. The lower-ranking officers were also shouting to encourage the new recruits. Everyone understood one thing. They were cavalry and the other party was only infantry. Regardless of whether the charge failed or not, infantry would not be able to pursue the cavalry. The only thing to worry about was not being held back. There was also the Black Knight. But fortunately, the skeleton army was scattered, and the enemy's commander did not seem to have much experience. And Vance did not see the shadow of the Black Knight. The Black Knight and his nightmare horse were very conspicuous in such an environment, and there was no need to worry about where they would hide. The whole valley was open, and the nearest hill was 1,000 meters away. There was no need to worry about them suddenly appearing. Vance looked around and finally breathed a sigh of relief. The only thing that puzzled him was The expected magic attack did not come. What's the commander of Madara doing? He was a little puzzled and could not help but raise his head to look in Valerie's direction. They're about to miss their last chance. Chapter 853. Once again, I'm trying to get monthly votes for Blackie's new book, Calamity Descends. What's the commander of Madara doing? Valerie, the knight captain of the 1st Cavalry Brigade, was also thinking about this question. She looked up and saw that the skeleton army was doing something strange on the other side of the battlefield. The army was slowly turning around, but their movements were so slow that they looked like a dying old man. It was almost impossible for them to turn around and attack before the cavalry arrived. Madara's left wing was still directly threatened by Erwin's 2 cavalry brigades. Valerie could even tell that even if her attack passed through them, they would not be able to turn around in time to surround them. This was a great opportunity. However, Valerie saw that the skeleton army was spreading out, as if deliberately making a path for her. If this scene happened to a human army, then according to the description in the cavalry manual, the enemy would have already collapsed, and the only thing left to do was to drive them forward like ducks. However, the female knight captain had a strong sense of vigilance in her heart, because in front of her was an army of the undead, and it was impossible for the undead to collapse in morale, unless something happened to the necromancers who were driving the skeletons behind. Could it be that someone was attacking the Madara army from behind? Just as this thought flashed through her mind, something suddenly appeared in her field of vision, and it immediately made her heart sink. She saw that behind the opening, a few tall figures suddenly appeared. They were not the clumsy corpse monsters or the crusaders, nor were they the Black Knight with a burning soul fire under their armor. They were some strange riders like skeletons riding on horseback. They were covered in heavy black mail armor and wielded long spears. The war horses under them were also bony, and their whole body was covered in tattered armor. At first, a few of these riders appeared, but as the opening became bigger and bigger, their numbers gradually became terrifying. Valerie's eyes widened in surprise. She saw a whole cavalry behind the dense skeleton archers. It was definitely not the Black Knight because it was impossible for there to be so many Black Knights. The skeleton riders were next to each other and the front was almost a mile wide. It was dark and gloomy like a city wall. Slow down and change direction. Valerie's heart felt as if it had been pierced by a sharp needle. She suddenly understood what it was, the skeleton knight. Madara had a new type of troop that they had never seen before. Suddenly, a sharp whistle sounded from the other side of the battlefield. Valerie glanced over and knew that Vance had also seen those strange riders. Their reactions were very fast. Although they didn't know how strong their opponents were, one thing was certain. They had more people than them and a lot more. If the skeletal riders were able to keep up with them, it would be a disaster for the White-Winged Cavalry Regiment even if they were extremely weak. This was because even though they were sharp, they were also weak. Once they were held back by the tens of thousands of skeletons, there would only be one outcome. That was to be defeated and turned into one of those monsters. After losing their cavalry in the Grimoire's Passage, there would be no defensive forces from the Silverman Valley to Kirkle. This meant that the entire Grimoire's Passage was open to Madara. Valerie was drenched in cold sweat. She didn't dare to imagine what the outcome would be. It was almost a replica of the War of the Black Rose, and it might even be worse because the Southern Legion was still in Ampere Seal. If the Grimoire's Passage failed, only Karsuk would be left in the Southern Territory. The White-Winged Cavalrymen were clearly aware of their situation. These experienced riders turned around one after another. The 2 cavalrymen turned extremely quickly on the battlefield, but in Valerie's eyes, it was so slow that it made her anxious. She saw the skeleton riders start to speed up, and the whole army was so uniform that it looked like a huge machine. At this time, the female knight captain finally realized how terrifying this cavalry unit was. Then she thought of another bad news, which was that this cavalry unit might be like the Black Knight. They didn't have to worry about the endurance of the war horses. Her heart suddenly turned cold. At this time she could only place her hopes on Walter's command. But what made her very uneasy was why the commander still hadn't given the order to retreat. Was he planning to bury the entire White-Winged Cavalry unit here just to prove how terrifying Madara's army was? Valerie anxiously turned her head and looked at the hills in the north, hoping to see the expected signal. Unfortunately, the north was silent. At this time, a sharp whistle suddenly swept across the sky above the battlefield. Everyone couldn't help but look up and see strange flying creatures flying over their heads. The town was in a sea of fire. Looking around, there were blue flames burning everywhere. Other than that, there were also the destroyed White-Winged Cavalry unit or the garrison's temporary defense line on the streets. There were corpses everywhere, wearing the militia uniform, the white-winged cavalry uniform, or the same garrison uniform as him. The only thing they all had in common was that they were all covered in blood and had stopped breathing. Ivan's gaze only lingered on these corpses for a short while before he slowly walked past these areas. A small group of garrison members were following behind him. He had just learned that their instructor had died in the hands of the monster that flew to the church steeple first. And he also knew that the monster's name was Dreadwraith. But there was even worse news. It was said that Butchie's 1st Cavalry unit had been completely destroyed in the street battle. Commander Portland had also been killed. Now the 1st Cavalry unit only existed in name. The remaining people were like the people following them. They didn't have the will to fight, and the only thought left was to survive. Just a moment ago they were filled with passion and wanted to fight for Erwin. But although the ideal was beautiful, the reality was too cruel for them to accept. They were almost immediately taught a cold lesson. The only thing that made Ivan feel a little relieved was that Ronnie's carriage had already left the town before the battle began. It was said that the white-winged cavalry was fighting outside the town, so she and the rest of the family should be able to reach Svenfano safely. But what would happen after that, even he himself didn't know. There were so many skeletons in Madara, and the town was almost filled with those monsters. Now the young man was very doubtful that they could defend the town. The group of people were like fleeing beggars as they walked out of the unfamiliar town. They didn't go far before they were stopped. There was a fierce battle happening on the only street leading out of the town. Ivan quickly identified the two sides of the battle should be Madara's skeletons and the town's militia. It was basically a one-sided massacre. When they arrived, there was no one alive on the scene. The Lich was awakening the fresh corpses. The soldiers who were fighting for Erwin a moment ago were swinging their swords at them with blood all over their bodies. It's Rala and the others. They're all dead. One of the guards said with a pale face. Ivan's expression changed as well. These militia were the townspeople that he usually saw all the time. But now they had turned into something else. He couldn't help but glance at the sneaky Lich on the other side of the street and clenched his teeth. How unlucky, there's a Lich. Vice Captain Ma Dong spat and pulled out his sword. We have to think of a way to kill it so we can continue moving forward. You guys think of a way to attract the attention of those monsters. I'll go cut that guy. The Lich's power is on its staff. As long as I can catch it off guard and cut off its arm, then this battle should be easy. Ivan looked at him and felt that he wasn't so optimistic. Be careful. He reminded. Pay attention to this area. There were at least 3 to 4 small groups of militia. This is the only way out of the town. They're in charge of covering the rear. So what? The instructor told us that a Lich can lead 10 to 12 skeletons. Can't kill so many people. That's not necessarily true. Ma Dong shook his head. These militia have no fighting power in this situation. They're not professional soldiers like us. Ivan saw that Ma Dong didn't listen, so he could only shut up. He turned around and gestured to the others, indicating that they should attack together with him to attract the Lich's fighting power. The distance between the two sides was less than 50 meters. In fact, he wasn't too worried about a head-on battle because they had more people. The Lich could only summon 2 or 3 corpses in a short time. Ma Dong was right. The militia's fighting power in this kind of situation was greatly reduced. Sometimes they could even be killed by a few skeletons because they were already scared out of their wits. But the skeleton archers hidden in the burning building caused them a lot of trouble. Almost half of their casualties were caused by these 2 skeleton archers. Fortunately, although the battle wasn't going well, at least the Lich's subordinates fell one by one. At this time, Ma Dong finally seized the opportunity. He quietly passed through the shadows of the other side of the building and approached the Lich without anyone noticing. But when he pulled out his sword and was about to make the final strike, a sudden change occurred. Ma Dong, be careful. Ivan suddenly shouted. He was worried about Ma Dong's plan, so he was always paying attention to that direction. When he saw that Ma Dong was about to make a move, a black shadow suddenly fell from the sky. This scene was too familiar. That was how their instructor had died. Ma Dong reacted at the last moment, but this deputy captain of the guards had no time to react at all. With a loud crash, a gigantic creature had already descended from the sky, bringing countless tiles with it as it landed on him. It grabbed his shoulder and its sharp claws pierced through his collarbone and shoulder armor, lifting him up from the ground. Ma Dong let out a painful scream. At this time, the others finally saw the monster's appearance. It looked a little like a shrunken skeleton dragon. His body was made of only bones and no skin. On its huge head, there were a pair of burning soul flames in its eye sockets, like 2 pillars of light. It had sharp teeth. The only difference between it and the skeleton dragon was that it had a sharp beak at the front of its mouth. Phallus? Someone screamed as he recognized the monster, but that was not enough to save Ma Dong. The Zhu Ling pecked at the vice-captain's head, crushing it into pieces. The vice-captain spasmed, and his whole body collapsed like a deflated balloon. The phallus pecked Ma Dong to death and threw the body away. Then it looked up at the others and let out a terrifying scream. Ivan felt a chill run through his body and his mind went blank. But the others around him reacted faster. One of the guards screamed and turned to run. But before he could run a few steps, a green light hit him in the back. His whole body swelled up and exploded into a bloody mist. This scene woke everyone up. There was still a necromancer here. And it was not to be underestimated. Evan could only watch as the monster raised the bone staff at him. He wanted to dodge, but he could not move his body even a single step. Ronnie? Chanali silently closed Rosa's eyes. In her last moments, the female knight's eyes were staring straight at the sky. The lich had opened a large hole in her chest. Her original appearance could no longer be seen. All that was left was a mess of flesh and blood. He didn't say a word. He took off his uniform and covered her with it. They had known each other for a long time. They had experienced the War of the Black Rose together, and even participated in a few major battles. They were also veterans in the cavalry regiment, so they had the rank of sergeant. They thought this was just a small border conflict, but they didn't expect to be separated by life and death here. Although he had experienced a lot of life and death separations in the past year, he still felt a little uncomfortable at this moment. There were new types of soldiers among the skeletons, such as the phallus. They had only appeared in the battlefield of Karsuk before. Why would they suddenly appear in the Dark Lord's army in the south of Buchi? The number of necromancers was also much rarer. If it wasn't for the fact that there was another necromancer behind the necromancer and the phallus, Rosa wouldn't have died. Chanali wanted to curse out loud. What the hell were those damn scouts doing? He looked at Rosa's face and carefully studied it for a while. Then he slowly walked through the street. The street was full of broken corpses. Some of them were still intact, but there were 1 or 2 arrows stuck in their bodies. But he suddenly stopped. He saw a familiar face among the corpses. It was one of the young couple he had seen before. Pitiful worm. He thought, but still walked over. It's fate. At least you can die with dignity. He wanted to drag the boy's body down from the ruins. But when he held the boy's hand, he was shocked. There was warmth and a pulse. He's not dead yet. He suddenly reacted and hurriedly pulled the young man down. Then he slapped his face with all his might. When Ivan regained consciousness, the first thing he saw was Shanali's blood-stained face. He remembered that he had seen this man before. He was standing with a female knight at the entrance of the city hall with an arrogant look on his face. I didn't expect you to die too, he replied in a daze. Dye your head, idiot. Chanali slapped him. Get up now. You're lucky. If you still want to see your little girlfriend, you better get up. I'm not dead. Evan seemed to wake up. Really? Tears flowed down his face uncontrollably. Chanali looked at the useless kid lying there in tears and couldn't help but want to kick him. But after hesitating for a while, he sighed and turned to look at Rosa. All right, you're a man. Show some courage. He reached out and pulled the boy up. There's no one left in the town. You know the way, right? Take us away from this damned place. Evan looked at him in a daze and hurriedly nodded. Valerie understood that the White-Winged Cavalry Regiment was finished. But she still didn't understand why the deputy commander didn't react at all. Unless he had already escaped, but that was almost impossible. She looked on helplessly as the skeleton horseman pierced its own chest with its spear. All the strength in her body seemed to have left her body. She raised her head with difficulty and looked around. The skeleton horseman's corpses were piled up in layers around her. But unfortunately it was meaningless. I'm going to become one of them, she thought. Vance was dead and so was Valerie. The remaining White-Winged cavalrymen were scattering, but countless fear wraiths were killing their hopes of escape. The entire battlefield was now a horrifying picture. Specks of soul fire were pushing forward, and the skeleton army was chasing the remaining humans away. But they would eventually be caught because whether it was warhorses or humans, they would never be a match for the undead in a competition of endurance. Evan stared at the scene in a daze. He had thought that the catastrophe in the town was just a part of the war. But now it seemed that there was no more war and only a massacre was left. Shanali's face was also gloomy. The White-Winged Cavalry Regiment was finished. He knew this better than Evan, but he didn't understand why the battle had turned out like this. At least the 2nd and 3rd Brigade should have been able to escape. Even in the worst-case scenario, the 3rd or 2nd Cavalry Brigade would be left behind to cover the retreat, and at least one cavalry brigade would be able to escape. But now it was all over. He could almost imagine that the only path left for Madara's army was the passage to Grimoires. The southern border was completely destroyed. Even the two of them might not be able to escape alive from the undead creatures that covered the mountains and plains. What should we do? Evan looked at the knight and couldn't help but ask in a low voice. The warhorse he was sitting on was Rosa's. He was not used to riding, but he had to get used to the current situation. Fortunately, he had learned horsemanship when he was in the garrison. Otherwise he would have been tied to the horse. Go east, Shanali said in a low voice. The hills to the east are our only chance. There are still some bandits there. Hopefully they will take us in, Shanali replied grimly. Bandits and bandits. Evan subconsciously looked in that direction. He remembered that there was a group of them, but they were the main problem for the militia and the patrolling cavalry. They had little to do with the garrison. They seem to be from Tosankard. They are real desperados. Will they take us in? He couldn't help but ask. Bandits or undead, you choose? Bandits, the young man answered without hesitation. Chapter 855. The Silman River Valley had already been reduced to a land of ashes. The night was still dark. Under the moonlight, the undead army had split into several groups as they marched along the rolling hills. Looking down along the riverbank, Owl Town was only left with scattered ruins and remains. Countless skeletons circled around the town, and monotonous cracking sounds echoed in the wilderness. Between the long lines, corpses were piled high. The liches were picking out the intact corpses and reviving them into warriors. The cold night wind blew from the direction of the mountain pass. It seemed to carry the eerie incantations that they chanted, making the atmosphere of the valley even more creepy. The blood staff stood alone in the night wind, still letting the cold wind tug at the corner of its ghoul robe. It glanced at a mutilated corpse not far away. It should be a human militia. Judging from the wound, he should have died at the hands of the Dreadwraiths. Only half of his body was left. His hand was still holding a sharp rock on the ground. The blood staff could imagine that he must have struggled to break free before he died, but the Dreadwraiths tore his body apart with their sharp claws and fangs. It raised its head again and looked at the valley. The battle in the valley had already ended. There was not a single living creature in sight. There was only dead silence. It was a perfect victory. It was as if it had witnessed the prophecy of the Dark Prophecy, that the kingdom of darkness in the east would rise. Those pathetic Erewhon bastards. They must not understand why they lost so badly. Behind the blood staff, a young man with a face as pale as a corpse smiled, showing his white teeth. He did not have fangs, nor did he have the ghastly fire in his eyes like the Black Knight. There were no psychic runes on his body, and he was not a necromancer. He was wearing a neat black suit as if he had just returned from a funeral. He took a deep breath. The taste of magic in the land is so fragrant. If it was in the Sea of the Dying Moon, only a real lord would have the right to own such a territory. He looked at the blood staff again and shook his head regretfully. I really don't understand why you can't defeat such weak opponents. I don't understand. But such lowly fellows do not have the right to own such good land. This kingdom will only be left with tombstones and graveyards. The blood staff snorted coldly. These dark lords came from the Dead Moon Sea. It was said that in the east, where magic was barren, the strife between necromancers was even more ruthless. That was the land of 4 wars. However, these unruly fellows were indeed very powerful. The necromancers there invented a spell to extract half-corporeal and half-spiritual dreadwraiths from the pterosaur corpses, and a way to let necromancers command skeleton knights. Their addition of I heard that there is a White Lion Legion in the north of the human kingdom. I wonder how strong they are. The young man turned around and asked. There used to be, but they were defeated by the Southern Legion. I heard that the little princess dismembered her brother's army. Today the Legion is only in name to this kingdom. Erewhon's civil war between the North and the South had ended less than 4 months ago. The blood staff was not very clear about the details of the war. Even so, there were still many rumors about the losers who experienced the war that flowed into the Dark Kingdom. He chose to believe the story that most of the Dark Lords agreed with. Then it's not worth mentioning. The young man's scornful tone was carried far away by the night wind. Overhead, under the starry night, a dreadwraith was whistling through the night sky. Behind it, there were dozens of monsters spreading their wings. Each of them was like a floating shadow sweeping across the entire valley. Looking down from the sky, there were specks of phosphorescence on the ground, forming 3 neat long dragons. The heads of the dragons were passing through the Grimoire's tunnel and entering the Slovenian region. In front of them there was already an endless stretch of lowlands. That was the direction of the capital of the province, Fort Kirkel. However, further away in the hilly region of the east, there was a small group of people standing at the edge of the forest. 1, 2, 3, 4. A group of 14 people was standing beside the horses. A thin young man with a sallow complexion was quietly counting the flames in the valley below. The nearest flame was only the size of a fingernail from this distance. Meanwhile, the ones further away were like the embers and sparks of a bonfire. These flames were scattered across the entire Silverman Valley, like a string of beads in the dark night. The young man's face turned a little gloomy. After he finished counting, he turned around and answered the others, "The white-winged cavalry is probably done for. Owltown, Roden, Milltown, it's all done for. I don't know how many of them survived. I don't think there are many. Thumb and the others just returned from Roden a few days ago. They said that not many escaped. These people are probably all done for. Can you stop talking about it? So irritating." The young man who was still sitting on the horse was not in a good mood. If he had heard that the white-winged cavalry had been completely annihilated, he would have clapped his hands in celebration. But when he saw this scene with his own eyes, he could not bring himself to laugh. Every ball of fire in the darkness was countless lives, and this made him think of his hometown. If it was really like what the Lord said, then perhaps one day the whole of Awen would become like this. He could not help but shudder. Everyone present had the same thought at this moment. They turned to look at the young man in a vest standing at the back. Carglass put down the brass binoculars in his hand and handed it to a young officer from the White Lion Guards. After the battle in Ampere Seal, he and the young men around him were no longer as naive as they were when they were in Tonajol. Their every move had become more mature, or rather more like a real soldier. He looked at the youths who were dressed like mountain people. Some of them should be the ones who were rescued by Brendel from the Schaflund mines. Brendel had told him that these people were destined to become great figures in the future, but he did not believe it at first. But now it seemed that Brendel's ability to foresee the future was truly extraordinary. After leaving Schaflund, the young man named Cohen led a group of people directly over the Greyhar Mountains. When the Southern Legion left, they attacked the mining area south of the Tosankade forest and dragged out a large number of convicts. Then they headed east into the hills of the Silman region. Although they still could not get rid of the bandits' aura, they had already become the king of the area. The crux of the matter was that the group of convicts selected by the young man were almost all exiles who had offended the nobles, while the truly valiant and unruly ones were not taken in. On the surface, it seemed a little unwise, but if one thought about it carefully, there was another meaning behind it. That young man is not simple at all, Carglass thought to himself. Mr. Carglass, what do we do now? Should we go back first? The young man on the horse asked. Shoo! Carglass put up a finger and gestured for the others to be silent. Is there a situation? Carglass nodded. Quickly hide. The group quickly retreated from the open area at the top of the hill into the forest behind them. About a minute later, a gust of wind blew over their heads. The young men hiding in the bushes stared at the shadows flying over their heads with pale faces. There were 7 of them in total. Carglass was the first to pull his horse up from the ground. The White Lion sergeant beside him shook his head and said, It's not a skeletal vulture. I've never seen it before. Is it a skeletal dragon? The young men chattered among themselves. Carglass pursed his lips and shook his head. It was not a skeletal dragon. Skeletal dragons had the natural aura of fear of high undead creatures. Carglass had seen Alaz in Valhalla and had some influence on the aura of dragons. When those things flew over their heads, he did not feel the slightest bit of fear. Moreover, as bone dragons, those things were a little too small. Mr. Carglass? They seem to be looking for something. Carglass replied, Let's wait and see. They won't find us so easily in the hills. When the day comes, the undead will withdraw their defenses. It won't be too late to return then. Dozens of skeletal knights were galloping along the mountain path. The metal mail on their war horses clanged against each other in the night. When the horses' hooves hit the ground heavily, the sound was not as thick and heavy as that of ordinary war horses. Instead, it sounded hollow as if it came from the depths of hell. As they looked down at the valley below, their soulfire eyes quickly reflected 2 human cavalrymen who were running for their lives. They had been running for half an hour in this direction, and their war horses were about to give out. The leader of the skeletal knight pointed his Stygian steel scimitar downwards. The skeletal knights immediately turned around and rushed into the forest. In this area, the trees and shrubs on the hillside were sparse, but there were still skeletal knights who crashed into trees and were smashed into pieces. However, the remaining undead did not even look at their defeated comrades. After passing through the forest that was nearly 100 meters long, they suddenly emerged from the meadow. When Evan turned around, he happened to see this scene. Under the bright moonlight, 11 skeletal knights charged out of the dark and dense forest with green phosphorescence flickering in their eyes. Their bare arms held up their spears and scimitars, reflecting the cold light of the moonlight. He couldn't help but be scared out of his wits. "Chanali, we're dead." "Shut up," Chanali replied in annoyance. However, he knew in his heart that they were going to lose their lives this time. These damn skeletons did not know what endurance was. They would probably continue chasing until dawn. However, there was still a long time before dawn. After such a long time of galloping in the mountains, their warhorses could not last for that long. "Hey kid," he suddenly shouted. "What's wrong?" Ivan replied breathlessly. His face was pale and his forehead was covered in cold sweat. It was as if he was suffering from a serious illness. His horsemanship was only average and was limited to the level of being able to ride a horse. However, under the pressure of survival, he was able to gallop in the mountains. This could not be said to be a miracle. However, the things that happened along the way were enough to scare him out of his wits. If not for his good luck, he would have fallen down the mountain stream or hit a tree and died. "I'll lure them away. You run east. Once you enter the dense forest, abandon your horse and run for your life. Once you're there, you'll be safe," Chanali panted and replied. Ivan's heart thumped. He looked at the back of the old horseman and almost cried. He quickly shook his head and said, "No, we'll go together. I was saved by you. How can I abandon you and run for my life? I can't do it." "If you can't do it, then we'll die together, idiot," Chanali scolded. "Let's die together then. Don't be stupid. We don't have to give them double the battle merits." Chanali scolded loudly. Then he muttered to himself, "All right, although the battle merits might not mean anything to them. Then I'll go lure them away. You saved me once and I saved you once. We're even now," Ivan replied. Chanali glanced at him and couldn't help but laugh. "Don't joke around. With your horsemanship, it's already Mother Marcia's blessing that you're not dead yet. If you try to lure them away, you'll still die together." Ivan's face turned red, but he knew that Chanali was telling the truth. He couldn't say anything. "All right, you still have your fiancée to see, but I have nothing to worry about. I'll drag a few of them down with me. You can live on with me." The old horseman shook his head. "Listen up, recruit. Don't be so shy like a girl. I'm telling you, the lives I owe on the battlefield are more than the meals you've eaten. Now it's my turn to repay my old comrades. Go live on." Ivan stared at him. He knew that the old horseman had made up his mind. He clenched his teeth and forced himself not to cry, but he couldn't make a sound. All he could do was nod. "That's right." Chanali seemed to be talking to himself. He suddenly drew his sword from his waist and shouted. He pulled on the reins and turned around to attack the skeleton knight. The young man seemed to have heard what he shouted. It was for Erwin. But following the sound of the wind, it sounded like a beast's howl. He turned around and urged his warhorse forward, but he saw Chanali's figure getting smaller and smaller. He rushed into the enemy's formation and cut down a skeleton knight with his sword. Then he passed through them. Those simple-minded skeletons were obviously shocked. They quickly turned around and chased after Chanali. Soon the two parties disappeared without a trace. But a few seconds later, he heard a faint shout coming from the woodland on the other side. "Damn skeletons, go to hell. Rosa." Ivan coughed loudly. He could feel a burning sensation in his lungs, but he knew that Chanali did not have much time left for him. The skeletons would soon catch up to him. He raised his head, trying to find the forest that Chanali had told him about. But all he could see was a wide meadow on the mountainside. It was flat. There were some sparse woods in the distance. But it was impossible to avoid the pursuit of Madara's undead. His heart was burning with anxiety as he urged his mount to continue forward. After circling around a large forest, an even more open grassland appeared behind the shrubs. However, at the end of the grassland, at the furthest end of his field of vision, there was a layer of something like a black carpet. "It's a forest?" Ivan was overjoyed. But then he felt a bitter taste in his mouth. It was too far, at least a few miles away. He didn't know if his horse could last that long. Suddenly, the sound of galloping horses came from behind him. He sensed something and turned around. Indeed, he saw a few skeleton knights appear at the edge of the forest. There were 7 of them in total, and Chanali alone had killed 4 of them. Unfortunately, the remaining ones were not something he could handle. No, I have to survive. Ivan gritted his teeth and said to himself. His life didn't belong to him anymore. He also had his fiancée and Chanali. No matter what, he had to give it his all. He clamped the horse's abdomen and stabbed the spur below the horse's abdomen. He wanted to increase the distance between them. But the monsters behind him were also as fast as ghosts. The distance between them was maintained for a few minutes. The forest was just in front of him. But at that moment, Ivan felt his body become lighter. It was as if a huge force came from behind him. He was thrown into the air and fell heavily on the meadow. He was dizzy from the fall. His body and arms were full of burning abrasions, but his mind was very clear. He understood what had happened. He grabbed the soil and got up. He looked back and saw his warhorse lying on the ground, foaming at the mouth. It was dying. Ivan couldn't help but scream. The forest was less than 100 meters away from him. He didn't expect to fail at the last moment. He tried to stand up and run forward, but he fell to the ground again as soon as he stood up. He rolled on the ground in pain. Then he realized that his leg was broken. It's over. Ivan's heart sank. The horsemen and their skeletal horses were getting closer and closer. But he could only close his eyes and wait for death. But at that moment, a silver light flashed in the forest in front of him. This silver light caused Ivan to be slightly startled. Before he could react, he saw the skeleton knight that was charging at the front suddenly flip over and fall off its horse. On its bald skull, there was a slightly swaying feather arrow stuck in it. The cold light in the forest was just the beginning. Suddenly, dozens of black shadows jumped out of the forest. They were cavalries, but they were definitely not from the White Wing Cavalry Regiment. Because Evan had already seen those cavalries coming closer and closer, their armor was faintly sparkling under the moonlight. The heads of the male lions on the armor were shining brightly. The cavalrymen passed by him. Their hooves fell like rain. The youth was still in a dream. He vaguely remembered that he had heard of such an army before. Soldiers, follow me and destroy these bastards. Karglai's roar echoed throughout the valley. Chapter 856. The silver moonlight shone through the dense foliage and sprinkled on the square, making it look as beautiful as it was during the day. Brendel stood on the balcony of the town hall, overlooking the quiet mountains and forests of the southern border under the night sky. 4 months later, Valhalla had completely formed the embryonic form of a small town. This towering tree was rooted under the mountains in the north of Schafland, and the diameter of its shade was more than 1,000 meters, covering the city below. But now the residents here were only the tree elves, the villagers of the Green Village, and some humans. Most of the humans were members of the Valhalla Wind Archers Guard. Another group of new residents were Kurluts, and the young men of the Folded Sword Squad also lived in the lower city. Valhalla's massive roots divided the city into 4 regions: north, south, east, and west. The Light Elves' newly constructed barracks was located in the western region. Looking down from the plaza, the western region was already beginning to take shape. The streets and buildings were divided neatly. Odom had to admit that as a descendant of the Rune Dwarves, he was quite capable. At the very least, he seemed to be born with a natural talent for city planning. The west region was mainly divided into 2 districts, the north and the south. There was a main street that ran across the entire west region, separating the 2 districts. In fact, this street ran through the city and circled around the lower city of Valhalla. Brando jokingly called it the Ring Highway, but other than him, no one knew what it meant. As time passed, everyone followed suit and called it the Ring Highway. The Ring Highway was also designed by Odom. It was modeled after the 2 rings of Valhalla, and he called it the Third Ring Highway. However, the design of the Ring Highway was not bad. In fact, Brando knew that the old dwarf was discussing with Monique if they could open up the bottom of Valhalla and build a cross-shaped street that would pass through the center of Valhalla's trunk. This way the entire lower city would be connected. Brando naturally understood the benefits of such a design. However, Odom's focus was mainly on defense because it would make it easier for the different districts of Valhalla to defend against each other. Monica didn't object to it. After all, Valhalla was huge and it wasn't a big deal to dig a tunnel from the center. After all, it wasn't a real tree but a magical city in itself. In the north and south districts of the west region, the main building in the north district was a military camp. Other than that, there were also some buildings that resembled human buildings. It was a newly built noble military camp. The noble military camp in the Kingdom of Erwin was no different from the other noble military camps in most human countries. There was a training ground and a camp, which was a functional building. In the game, it could significantly improve the training speed of the soldiers and the morale of the station troops. Brando thought that it might be because of the increased discipline brought by the centralized management of the army. It was just that the game had turned it into data. The White Lion Guards were stationed in this military camp, opposite the Wind Archers camp in the south. There were only 2 functional buildings in this huge city, so it was relatively empty. However, it was much better than the other 3 regions that had not been built yet. Brando was planning to move the entire city of Abes to Valhalla. After all, the city under the giant tree could not be kept a secret forever. In fact, after Odin ordered the workers to build the outer walls, many people had already guessed their lord's plans. However, it was impossible for them to guess that this was the legendary fortress. Brando claimed that this was the giant elven tree that was planted by the tree elves. With his relationship with the druids, no one could find fault with it. After all, there were many such trees in the dark forest, and the druids built their cities on top of them. Perhaps one day when Valhalla continued to grow, this lie would eventually be exposed. However, Brando believed that by then he would have nothing to hide. At least for now, Valhalla was still very fragile and needed to be protected. In fact, except for a few people around him, most people believed this story, including Veronica, who had been to Valhalla personally. She thought that this was a gift from the druids and did not even think about the legendary fortress. After all, it was a little too ridiculous. Moreover, she had seen it with her own eyes. The fortress had completely disappeared into the loop of trade winds. As for the others, including the young people of the Folded Sword Knight, they were still amazed when Brando brought them to the city. Some of them had heard from the young lady of the Flower Leaf territory about the magnificent druid city of trees, but they did not expect to see it with their own eyes and live here as guests for a period of time. One after another they expressed their interest. The scholar lady had come to him more than once to ask for permission to visit the city. Although Monica did not like these foreign guests, other than not letting Shido into the core area of Valhalla, Brando still gave her the right to visit from the lower area to the uppermost square. His generous move further dispelled everyone's suspicion, including the eldest prince. Today, the young people of the Folded Sword Knight were still temporarily living in the North City district. There were many tents there, but the military barracks and supporting buildings were also being planned for them. In the past 4 months, Monica's clan had increased to nearly 500 people. Now, the entire upper level of the tree canopy could be seen flying between the branches at any time. Under their control, the construction of Valhalla was getting faster day by day. However, the growth of the city itself had slowed down. According to Monica, it would take at least a few years for it to move from this stage to the next stage. One aspect was that the supply of magic could not keep up. Valhalla's demand for magic was a bottomless pit. In fact, almost 2/3 of the ore produced from the crystal mine in the Black Forest had been supplied to this territory, but it was only enough to maintain its daily operations. Tanagel's income from the magic crystal trade had been greatly reduced in recent months. Amandina had warned him about this several times, but the merchant lady was very optimistic about this. In her opinion, the magic crystal trade itself was not a long-term business. The key was that this kind of commodity was too sensitive and could easily attract covetous people. Generally speaking, the high-purity crystals produced by a crystal mine would be quickly consumed in the first few months. What followed was a long and difficult mining, but the output would decrease year by year. The crystal mine found in the Black Forest was extremely rare. If Tanagel continued to export large amounts of these high-purity magic crystals, it would not be difficult for people to guess that a crystal mine with high reserves had been discovered in the territory. Now they could take advantage of the growth of Valhalla to reduce the amount of crystals they sold. As for the decrease in income, in fact, the development of other minerals and specialties in the Black Forest had gradually made up for this. Most importantly, many of the resources in the territory were now self-sufficient. Therefore, the financial dependence on trade had been reduced by a lot. On the other hand, the number of light spirits was also a problem. Monica's 500 clansmen had reduced the time it took for Valhalla to grow from the first stage to the second stage to less than half a year. But if they relied on their own efforts for the next stage, it would take at least 5 years. If he wanted to reduce this time to a year, he would need at least 2,000 to 3,000 light spirits. But the production of light vortices was still only 20 per month. The Moon Tower was currently serving the Mage Tower in the county of Abes Castle, contributing to Tanagel's first batch of wizard apprentices. Not to mention that it was impossible to use it to increase the production of light vortices at this time. Even if it doubled the production of light spirits, it would still take several years to reach that number. The gains did not make up for the losses. The only way now was to first develop the territory and let Valhalla become self-sufficient. Then he would continue to think of other ways to increase the production of mana. There were many ways to increase the production of mana, but it had to be done step by step. Currently the territory only had the Crystal Pool, Mage Tower, Light Vortex and Moon Tower. But Brando knew of a few other advanced buildings that could greatly speed up the construction of the territory. But first he needed blueprints and second he still needed more mana pools. While thinking about these thoughts, Brando took a deep breath and withdrew his gaze from the quiet city below. He turned back and walked back to the hall from the terrace. Valhalla's tree hall was much livelier than it was during the day. Except for Karglais, almost all the officers of the White Lion Guards were gathered here, and against them were more than a dozen sergeants of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. Medisha, Hipamera, Amandina, the Shire, and several mercenary commanders stood on the other side. As his old subordinates and confidants, they formed a circle of their own. The remaining smaller circle was the eldest prince and Shido, as well as Lorena and her husband, and the little Prince Haruz. What made Brando a little strange was that the eldest prince did not seem to intend to mix with the young men of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. But he understood the other party's thoughts after a little thought. The other party did not seem to want to oppose him here. This was a statement. On the one hand as a guest and on the other hand, it was unnecessary because Lenoret knew very well that he, Brando, could not really control these people. These young people from Cruz were rooted in the Empire, and their families, futures and future were all in that homeland. If Erwin was a behemoth like the Empire it might be attractive to some people, but Erwin was just a small kingdom. He did not have to worry about these young men of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment being truly loyal to him, Count Tonagel. Therefore there was no need for him to fight with these young officers. He was a member of the royal family and must maintain his detached status. His Royal Highness must be very clear-headed and had already figured this out. He understood that if he wanted to control this regiment of knights, he had to give him enough respect because nominally, the Folded Sword Knight Regiment was also loyal to his Royal Highness. Although people with discerning eyes knew what was going on, this layer of skin between nobles was very important, and no one would take the initiative to tear it down. Perhaps even the young men of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment understood this, but they did not mention it. And it was precisely because of this that he had to act according to the rules. Veronica and Mangrove must have thought so as well, which was why they were relieved to hand these young men over to him. Brando suddenly realized that he had taken things for granted, but he shook his head. This was enough. He did not really intend to take these people into his pocket. He just needed a group of people to help him fight against Madara. The country under the shadow of the East was growing stronger day by day, and the White Lion Knight Regiment that he cultivated could only be considered as an outstanding force in Erewhon. But compared to the next generation of talents that Cruz carefully cultivated, the Folded Sword Knight Regiment, it was still a far cry. The key was that he did not have much time left. He had to arm this army that belonged to Erewhon before the Second War of the Black Rose arrived. Otherwise he would completely lose his claws under the blooming Black Rose. One Freya was not enough. Then what about the Folded Sword Knight Regiment? When he walked into the hall, there was still a heated argument going on. It could be said that it was extraordinarily lively. Both sides were arguing about whether to attack Count Randner or the undead of Madara first. Brando raised his head and looked at the huge map of Erewhon hanging on the wall. There was a red cross on the map where Silverman was located. The White-Winged Knight Regiment had been defeated. It was exactly the same as in history. But this time he had even warned the Grenoir's side, but those rigid noble officers still made the same mistake. In fact, there was a dispute between Duke Grenoir's and the royal faction about whether or not they should warn Duke Grenoir's. That was because Makarov and the others believed that if they followed the original plan of luring the Bloodstaff into the target area, they must not alert the Bloodstaff. But if they did not warn the Grenoir's side, the princess would lose the support of the people, and more importantly, the people of Silverman and Butchie would suffer heavy losses. In the end, the princess personally wrote a letter to the Duke to explain the matter. Brando felt that the reasoning of some people in the royal faction was ridiculous. A year later, Madara and Erewhon were both on guard against each other. If one side was preparing for war and the other side did not react, then it would alert the Bloodstaff. After all, this was no longer the year of blossoms and summer leaves, but the last season of the Year of Swords. Unfortunately, everything that happened made him very angry. At the same time he despised the old noble system of the kingdom more and more. The descendants of the ancient nobles were not worthy of their current status. He sighed. There was no doubt that the Bloodstaff would head straight for Viro, just like in history. Even though it was in cahoots with Radner, its goal was different from Radner's. Its goal was to completely occupy Grenoir's and Viro, cutting off Karsuk's connection with the rest of Aween. Only with such an achievement could it be justified in the eyes of Madara's supreme ruler and earn it a higher status. The blood staff should know that it had already caused Madara to be wary of it. If it did not take the initiative to attack, then it could only close its eyes and wait for death. However, Count Randner was different. His goal was to rely on Madara to secure a territory that could be defended and attacked. He had completely fallen out with the royal faction, and the best outcome he could hope for was to become independent from Erewhon and become a neutral autonomous region between Erewhon and Madara. If he did not succeed, then he would at least be able to escape to Madara. That was why his goal was to conquer the Silman and Slovenia regions. However, he had a common goal with the Blood Staff, and that was Kirkle Castle. Furthermore, Count Randner would attack Kirkle Castle before the Blood Staff. Before news of his collusion with Madara spread, he would think of a way to trick the gates of Kirkle Castle into opening under the guise of reinforcements. This was the most convenient method. Even if it was exposed, it would be easy to besiege Kirkle Castle. There was no longer any obstacle in front of the Blood Staff, and the nobles of Kirkle Castle would definitely order the Vermilion Legion to continue south from Brags to stop the undead army. At that time, the rear would be completely empty, and there would be no way to stop Count Randner. However, that was only an if. There were enemies that Count Randner did not expect waiting for him to walk right into their trap. The outcome of this battle was already decided, and the only thing left to do now was to plan how to make them fail. He interrupted his thoughts and came to Maynold's side. Maynold was studying a detailed map on the table. She noticed Brando's arrival and looked up at him, whispering, "You've become stronger after returning from the deadly tundra." Brando was slightly startled. This seemed to be the first time Senior had spoken to him in private after returning from the deadly tundra. He nodded and did not deny it. He had practically shared the experience of the final battle with Milos with Freya. Even though he did not know if the others would benefit from the experience, it was still a huge source of income for him. It was not inferior to the benefits he gained from the loop of trade winds. He had already raised the ranks of the Templar Knight and Mercenary to the peak, and there was basically no need for him to level up these two classes in the future. He had also unlocked the opportunity to become a Frostborn Guard from Sabers, but he had not invested any experience into it yet. This was because there were many branches to choose from for high-grade classes, and Brando was still considering them. Maynold looked at him quietly and asked, "Did you leave Dark Ko-Hua and Kind Ko-Hua behind because of Ekis?" Brando was stunned for a moment before he realized that this was what she really wanted to ask. "Did you feel it?" he asked. "It's different from the game," the female knight replied. "The future of this world." You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.